Yes. 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 Okay. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening. Depends on your location. Thank you for joining us today at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Our audience is spread, several hundred of you are spread at least through 3 time zones. So it's either good afternoon or good evening or good morning. Depends on your location. My name is Khalid Jafshan, and I'm Executive Director of the Arab Center here in Washington, D.C. ACW is a nonprofit, independent, and nonpartisan research organization dedicated to furthering the political, economic, and social understanding of the Arab world in the United States, and to provide insight on U.S. policies and national interests in the Middle East at large. On behalf of our executive board of directors, our academic advisory board, and our colleagues at Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies in Doha, Tunisia, Paris, and here in Washington, I would like to welcome all of you to this virtual conference starting today and continuing through tomorrow and Friday of this week. Ladies and gentlemen, as the United States completes its admittedly messy withdrawal from Afghanistan and prepares to scale back its involvement in the Middle East, global powers such as Russia and China are working to increase their influence in the region. Such great power competition is testing American influence and global engagement as a resurgent Russia and a rising China vie for power and influence through diplomatic, military, and economic means. They continue to exploit regional crises and opportunities to advance their objectives and to strengthen their footholds across the Middle East and North Africa. The strategic vacuum left by the rushed withdrawal by the United States is similarly challenged, of course, and manipulated by regional powers seeking to advance their own interests in Afghanistan as Taliban resumes rule in the country, including, of course, neighboring countries like Iran, Pakistan, India, and a little bit more distant neighbors, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and various Central Asian countries such as Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. As President Biden reminded us in his August 16 speech at the White House, and I'm quoting, "Our true strategic competitors, China and Russia, would love nothing more than the United States to continue to funnel billions of dollars in resources and attention into stabilizing Afghanistan indefinitely." End of quote. Will China and Russia succeed in taking advantage of this rushed and somewhat disorderly withdrawal from Afghanistan to further undermine U.S. credibility at home and abroad, and more importantly, to depict the United States as a diminished and weakened global power, the way Washington did to the Soviet Union upon its own less than dignified withdrawal from Afghanistan going back to May 15, 1988 through February 15, the following year, 1989. Will Chinese and Russian propaganda succeed in portraying the failure of the 20-year-old US adventure in Afghanistan as a second Vietnam ordeal for Washington, whether this administration or future administrations? Clearly, there are many lessons to be learned from the disastrous end of the American war in Afghanistan, the longest in modern history for the United States. They're not only vital lessons, to analyze and fully understand domestically for internal American consumption, but they are equally applicable and of long-term implications for US allies in Europe and in the Arab Middle East, the Arab countries in the Middle East. European allies are wondering whether it is wise for them to follow the lead of Washington in engaging in endless wars or ill-defined international adventures that end up indirectly undermining their own credibility in the eyes of their own constituencies. We've heard all kinds of murmurs coming from NATO allies who are questioning the declared intentions of the Biden administration to differentiate itself from its predecessor, the Trump administration, by being, on the one hand, more involved globally and link American leadership with close alliances and coordination with key partners worldwide. Yet that was not applied in the case of Afghanistan. Many European allies are left pondering what happened to American consultation promised before the speedy pullout officially declared on July 8, 2021. As for the Middle East, Arab regimes accustomed and some quite addicted, frankly, to a close security relationship with the United States are worried about what happened in Afghanistan over the past 5-6 weeks at least, that culminated in the triumphant return of the Taliban movement to Kabul. Countries that have counted for a long time on the premise that the United States of America will come to their rescue if they were in trouble, domestic or foreign, are interpreting the Afghan government collapse to be a direct result of the US withdrawal announcement by both President Donald Trump and President Joe Biden. They thus are quickly questioning where they stand on the priority list of US foreign policy under this administration, evaluating the efficacy of their relationship with Washington, and some, more ominously, are even looking to bolster their security with different new alliances or alliance patterns and partners such as Russia and China, as complicated and as difficult such strategic pivot might be. Arab leaders and opinion makers over the past few weeks have been wondering about American commitment to their allies' security despite the long-standing defense understandings, agreements, and relationships, including military guarantees, deployments, numerous bases in the region, headquarters for US troops in the area that they share with the United States. To be sure, Arab regimes who rely on military and security institutions that are heavily dependent on American arms, American training, American logistics, are beginning to question Washington's commitment to their survival and sustenance as they traverse the current difficult domestic challenges and regional strategic terrain. First and foremost, Arab allies are wondering whether Biden may have finally drawn the curtain in his new kind of Biden's philosophy, if you will, for foreign policy, the Biden doctrine called by some, that he might have finally drawn the curtain on American military interventionism in the wider Middle East region or commitments to many of its countries. For US partners and friends in the Arabian Gulf, this should translate into utmost care and caution regarding both the rhetoric about Iran, for example, and the wish to forcefully curtail its activities and intrusion on its neighbors' turf throughout the region. As the United States, in the words of its current president and Secretary of State, will only advise diplomacy from now on as the preferred strategy of dealing with whatever challenges the Islamic Republic of Iran presents, GCC members, for example, must and are beginning to reassess their own defense needs accordingly. Like other governments around the world, Arab regimes are worried about the real meaning of Biden's motto, America is back, which he introduced, of course, as a replacement for Trump's motto of America first. The same applies to President Biden's reassessment of the so-called nation building as a U.S. strategic objective, particularly as it applies to the region in the context of redefining overall U.S. national interests in the region, which have been somewhat stable, generally speaking, or unchanged for decades. Now, considering these and many other questions, Arab Center Washington, D.C. has opted this year in its 6th annual conference to focus on this topic, U.S. policy and global competition in the Middle East. Our excellent array of experts and guest speaker will assess the U.S. role and objectives in the region under the Biden administration during this ongoing dynamic shift in power and alliances in the post-Afghanistan era. Over the next 3 days, our panelists will also probe the impact of these overarching transformations, on issues of human rights and democracy, energy and geopolitical influence, arms sales, economic clout involvement in regional conflicts, including selectively, I admit, cases like Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Yemen, and policies toward Palestine and Israel and Iran. I would like here to thank you for your participation and hope that you will find the deliberations throughout the remaining time in this conference informative and intellectually stimulating. Let me, before we take a break to begin the first panel, let me remind you that throughout this conference, you are more than welcome to submit your questions to the speakers using the Q&A feature on your Zoom page or by email to events@arabcenterdc.org. Again, events@arabcenterdc.org who are watching beyond Zoom. You can also follow the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag ACW2021, ACW2021. If you haven't already done so, I invite you to visit our website, arabcenterdc.org, arabcenterdc.org, to register for day 2 and day 3 of this conference. Day 2 would be tomorrow on Wednesday, and day 3 would be Friday. Please remain online for just a few moments to prepare technically for panel 1 entitled Empowering Authoritarianism, Impact of Global Competition on Democracy and Human Rights in the Middle East, which will begin in about 10 minutes. So get your coffee, get your water, get your juice, whatever you need, and come back to your screen in about 10 minutes as we resume panel 1 for this day. Thank you very much.
countries. Good morning, everyone. Dan, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
All right, Dan, we are going to start in a few minutes as soon as one more panelist joins us. As soon as you see the banner start, you can start speaking.
Okay, I don't see my image yet, my face up there, but that you'll put that on, right?
Yeah, you can turn on your cameras, guys, and all the panelists, you can turn on your cameras now. And as soon as you see the banner come down, Dan, you can do the introduction.
Mine camera is not turning on.
Hi, Ken. Hi, Nader.
Thanks, Harley. Good to see you.
Hi, guys. Hope everyone's well.
There we go. Good morning, everybody. Neda, how are you? Long time.
And good to see you again. Hope
See
you're doing
you.
well.
Hope to come out to your neck of the woods someday when we
Let me know.
when we start doing that sort of thing again.
Yes, exactly.
Dan, let's start. I'll take down the banner, and as soon as you see it go away, you can do the introductions. Okay.
Great. Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Dan Brumberg. I am Associate Director of Government at Georgetown University and Director of the Democracy and Governance Program at Georgetown, and also a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this discussion today and this opening panel entitled Empowering Authoritarianism, Impact of Global Competition on Democracy and Human Rights in the Middle East. This is a subject that I'm especially interested in. I'm really delighted that we have 4 superb panelists who will examine the role of global power competition in empowering authoritarian regimes in the Middle East and North Africa, and the impact of these geopolitical dynamics on the status of human rights and democracy. I only add here that this is an enormously contentious issue politically as well as analytically. There's a considerable debate going on here in DC, obviously, and beyond about the actual impact of Russia and China, for example, on authoritarian regimes versus the domestic dynamics that support them. And this is one of the analytical debates. There's also a political debate, the notion of sharp power, which has been a fundamental sort of analytical concept advanced by the net and so on, really attributes a lot of the sustaining of autocracies and or the undermining of democracies to the influence of Russia and China. So it's an enormously important and complex issue that we're going to be discussing today. So I'm gonna briefly introduce the speakers today by order of their presentations, and then each of our speakers will have 10 to 12 minutes to summarize their ideas, and then we'll open it up to discussion. And of course, to remind you, as Khalil said, question and answer feature on Zoom by email, or you can send in a question at events@arabcenter.org. So without further ado, I'm very happy to introduce my colleague and friend, Neda Hashemi, who is an associate professor and director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. A second speaker will be Sahar Aziz, is a professor of law, chancellor, social justice scholar, and a Middle East and legal studies scholar at Rutgers University Law School. Her research examines the relationship between autocracy, terrorism, and the rule of law. Our third speaker will be Sarah Leah Whitson, who is the executive director of the Democracy for the Arab World Now, Dawn organization, an organization not established too long ago. She previously served as the executive director of the Middle East and North Africa division at Human Rights Watch. And then last, but certainly not least, Ken Roth, who has been the executive director of Human Rights Watch since 1993. He has conducted numerous human rights investigations and missions around the world. And I'm sure that everybody's familiar with Ken's work and the contributions he has made on human rights. So without further ado, Nader, the floor or the mic or the screen is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thanks to the Arab Center. It's a great honor to be on this panel. I want to comment mostly on U.S. policy in the Middle East and its impact on human rights and democracy. I do want to briefly comment at the end about the role of China and its expanding relationship with various Middle Eastern regimes in the Middle East, because I think this also has consequences for the struggle for human rights and democracy. What both American policy and Chinese Middle East policy have in common, rhetoric aside, is a shared focus on supporting authoritarian regimes in the Middle East and a shared opposition to democratic movements and human rights struggles in the region. It's widely believed both in Washington, D.C. and in Beijing that their national interests can best be preserved by pursuing this strategy of support for authoritarian regimes, which by definition implies opposing human rights and democratic struggles and movements across the region. Of course, there are some notable exceptions to this rule. If a pro-democracy protest takes place in an enemy state, then often you'll see, for example, official U.S. support for democracy and human rights. And just to cite one of many examples, the Green Movement in Iran in 2003 is a case in point. Other examples exist. Now, American patriots and supporters of Joe Biden's foreign policy, I'm sure, hate to be compared with the Chinese Communist Party in this manner. I strongly believe, however, that an objective reading of the factual and documentary record would support this conclusion of strong external support for authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, which is one reason why they persist and why this form of government continues to dominate the Middle Eastern landscape. I don't have time to go through this record. In the brief time that I have, I want to focus on an event taking place today at the Four Seasons Hotel in Washington, D.C., where representatives of both the Biden and Trump administrations will make a unique appearance together in support of the exact same policy. This is quite a rare occasion given the polarized political landscape in the United States. Also in attendance today at this event in Washington, D.C. will be members of the U.S. Congress, and they will be joined by representatives from Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, and other Arab states. Of course, I'm referring to the anniversary of the Abraham Accords, which overlaps with today, with the first anniversary. So allow me to use this as a point of departure to discuss the theme for this panel. And I want to draw upon a recent article that actually Sarah Leah Whitson brought my attention to that was published in the Times of Israel last week, entitled, "Israeli Officials Cautioned Biden Against Heavy Criticism of Egypt and Saudi Arabia." And it was authored by Jacob Magid, and he went on to describe that Israel fears that singling out General el-Sisi in Egypt and MBS in Saudi Arabia for their gross human rights violations risks sending these countries into the arms of China and Russia. Now, the backstory is one that you're all familiar with, that Joe Biden enters the White House vowing to place a premium on human rights in crafting his new foreign policy, warning that countries such as Saudi Arabia and Egypt would need to reform if they wanted to maintain their longstanding relationships with the United States. This approach has deeply worried the Israeli government, which believes that it could alienate Saudi Arabia's crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, and Egypt's dictator, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, leading them to look elsewhere, perhaps, for support and alliances, namely toward adversaries of the United States, China and Russia. These concerns, according to the article in the Times of Israel, have been repeatedly passed along to the Biden administration from Israel on multiple occasions. Now, the official justification for this policy is that Israel views Saudi Arabia and Egypt as part of a more moderate axis of Arab countries in the region with which it seeks to cooperate against Iran. And it has been reported in the past that Israel has lobbied the US government in support of economic aid for both countries. Now, this, of course, is all deeply tied to the Abraham Accords. This widely touted agreement, designed by Jared Kushner, was widely embraced by both American political parties and much of the US foreign policy establishment last year when it was announced. It formalized a series of longstanding relationships that had existed between Israel and a set of reactionary and repressive Arab states in the region, all of whom are strong American allies. The justification for support of the Abraham Accords is that this is a step in the right direction in terms of enhancing regional peace and stability in the region. And all things considered, it's a movement in the right direction for international peace and security. But of course, in truth, the Arab Accords represents a major setback for human rights and democracy in the region. It provides another reason for the United States to oppose democratization efforts and struggles for political freedom and more open societies. Recall that the Abraham Accords is effectively an agreement between Israel and a set of Arab dictatorships to establish formal relations and to ignore Palestinian human and national rights. Any movement in the direction of democracy and human rights in the Middle East could jeopardize and destabilize the political rule of many of the key signatories of the Abraham Accords. Thus, it is not difficult to understand the idea that the existence of the Abraham Accords is fundamentally predicated on the perpetuation of authoritarian regimes and its concomitant opposing democratization efforts in the region. So while Iran has driven the Arab states and Israel together, and there's no doubt that that is a big part of this emerging alliance, the more urgent threat, in my view, that binds Israel and its Arab allies together is the deep fear of regional democratization. This was openly on display during the Arab Spring, when both Israel and many Arab authoritarian regimes strongly opposed the Arab Spring revolutions, and they all celebrated the 2013 military coup in Egypt. In fact, the UAE and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia played a critical role in subverting Egypt's post-Mubarak transition, and a similar process is underway in Tunisia today for those that are following the story. So one of the big concerns here is that, we've had a very long-standing traditional set of arguments as to why the United States has to support authoritarian regimes in the region. And the argument basically is that these regimes, despite their internal repressive rule, are more politically stable. They preserve American interests in the region. They're better at preserving regional stability. The Arab Spring has been pointed to as proof of this, alleged proof of this, because Arab Spring revolutions bring chaos and instability, and just look what happened over the last 10 years in the region. Now, the Abraham Accords is now, I think, a new and significant added development that adds a new layer of opposition to support for democracy and human rights in the region. And of course, the DNA of the Abraham Accords is based on the assumption, as I just pointed out, of the perpetuation of authoritarian rule and repressing demands for democracy. The Abraham Accords assumes that only dictators can be reliable allies for Israel and the United States. And thus, democratic movements and struggles are viewed as a deep threat to this political arrangement. So now, as a result of the Abraham Accords, we have another key reason why the American foreign policy establishment will be negatively predisposed to movements for democracy and human rights, beyond the traditional argument that democracy in the Middle East is just too risky and too destabilizing, and it opens the doors for Islamists to come to power, et cetera. Now it will be argued, and we're seeing this already taking place, that the U.S. Has to oppose democracy in the Middle East, has to oppose human rights struggles in the Middle East, because it will undermine these wonderful peace agreements that have been lauded over the last year between Israel and various Arab states. So there's much more to say on this topic, but I think this development of the Abraham Accords represents, all things considered, a net setback for the question of human rights and democracy in the Middle East, particularly from the United States. Now, in the roughly 2 minutes that I have left, let me just say something very briefly about another development that is relevant to this topic, and that is China in the Middle East. And what's interesting about China in the Middle East is that as we speak right now, arguably the worst human rights crisis on the planet is unfolding in Xinjiang province in China. It's widely viewed by many people as a genocide, if not a genocide, then certainly a gross human rights catastrophe. And what's interesting is to see how the many states in the region have responded to this atrocity, ongoing set of human rights, extreme gross human rights violations by the Chinese Communist Party against the Uyghurs. Regimes across the Middle East, whether they're allied with Iran or Saudi Arabia, have actually responded in unison to basically support Chinese government policy against the Uyghurs. This was embodied in 2019 when the Organization of Islamic Conference had a foreign ministers meeting where they openly passed a resolution that, and I'm quoting from the resolution in 2019, that commended the efforts of the People's Republic of China in providing care to its Muslim citizens and looks forward to further cooperation between the OIC and the People's Republic of China. So not only have repressive regimes in the Middle East openly supported, not only have they been silent on the repression in Xinjiang, they have tried to whitewash it. They've tried to sort of praise and echo Chinese government rhetoric with respect to the mass incarceration of Uyghur Muslims. And the question then is why? How do we explain this? Because many of these countries, claim to be defenders of oppressed Muslims around the world and claim that this is a key reason why they, exist. But I think the reasons are not well understood. One reason is obviously economic. I think many countries in the region want good relations with China because of China's economic power. They want Chinese investment. But much more critically, I think what attracts many Middle Eastern authoritarian regimes across the region to China is the model of governance that they seek to emulate, that they see China representing. Specifically, the fact that China represents a strong state that has good relations with the world, but good economic relations with the world, and draws a very firm line when anyone in the international community speaks of human rights or democracy. That's a red line for these regimes, and it's a red line for China. And repressive authoritarian regimes, are deeply attracted to that sort of political model. Sure, come and meet with us, trade with us, but don't talk about democracy or human rights. We will break off relations if we need to. The other thing about China that I think strongly attracts authoritarian regimes in the Middle East to China is the strong surveillance state model that China is now implementing with facial recognition, with sort of internet censorship. That's an attractive model that many regimes in the Middle East seek to emulate, and it brings these two regions together. It brings China and the Middle East together around this shared sort of emerging, one could say, global authoritarian sort of set of alliances that take place, and that I think fundamentally come at the expense of the human rights and the democratic rights of people in the region. There's a lot more to say on this topic, but I'm over my time, and I look forward to the discussion during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nader, for those interesting remarks. We now go on to Sahar.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, see old friends and meet new ones, although I do wish we were in person. Thank you to the Arab Center for inviting me. So I'm going to use my time to be descriptive today and provide some analysis, but really in hoping to trigger lively discussion through Q&A with audience members, but also with my colleagues. And because I think one of the problems is we really haven't looked as much about the facts or looked at the facts and the relationships between Russia and the Middle East and China and the Middle East. Professor Hashemi did a great job right now of talking about the US. But because we're talking about global competition and because we're talking about a potential seismic change in US foreign policy, again, potential and it's arguable, from a focus, if not outright obsession on the Middle East to the so-called pivot east, I wanted to really focus on that. And I'm going to use a PowerPoint because I find that facts tend to, it's hard to do this online. So let me try this and hopefully I won't have too many technological difficulties. All right. There we go. Okay. And for those of you in Boston, I just want to let you know I'm a BU. Come and visit. So, but my hometown is Rutgers in New York. Okay. Really not. There we go. All right, so here are the key points I want to make. So first is, to the extent we're still having a conversation about why did democracy skip the Middle East and the waves of democracy, and I do think that the Middle East still stands out, although it's not the only region that lacks at least some form of democratic governance, with perhaps the exception of Tunisia, although we've seen some troubling regressions lately. That yes, there is exceptionalism in terms of democracy, but I just want to point out that it is not Islamic exceptionalism, it's Middle East exceptionalism. And that's important to say to a US audience because of all of the Islamophobia that comes with discussions on democracy and the Middle East. So I'll take a look at very quickly the failures of the Arab Spring. That's not the topic of my discussion, it's a separate panel. What I think is Russian intervention and Chinese neutrality. And again, as Professor Brumberg stated, these are all contentious points, and I acknowledge that, or this discussion. The global military complex that's ravaging and has been ravaging the Middle East, and then America's so-called pivot east and perhaps a Cold War light, I put in question mark, and the three main priorities, among others, that I think the US continues to have, which is military dominance, economic dominance, and energy access. So L. Carl Brown, who was a professor at Princeton and a Middle East scholar, one of his statements, well-known statements, was the Middle East is the most penetrated region of the world. As such, it is a region where the local actors have habitually preferred to have multiple external powers present so as to maximize their strategic autonomy by playing up and manipulating these external forces. We saw this at play during the Cold War with, to some extent, Nasser and other regimes. I think we see it, we used to see it more in the Gulf states. But I do think that this is something to consider now that China is rising, at least economically, potentially militarily, and Russia continues to want to be relevant and an essential actor in the region. So I'm not going to talk about why did the Arab Spring fail to bring democracy to the Middle East. We've had panels and conferences ad nauseum, but I just want to talk about the state of affairs. Right now, Egypt is essentially governed by the military, right? He's a former general who has now taken off his uniform officially and is wearing civilian clothing. But if you look at all the research, the military is effectively governing, and it's not even behind the curtain. Syria, you had the civil war, the vicious proxy war, and the victors were ultimately the dictator, al-Assad, and with his Syrian military support. So it also has a military rule, perhaps behind the curtain or perhaps not. Yemen, ongoing civil war and proxy war, humanitarian crisis, and in a very sad state of affairs, especially for humanitarian perspectives and human rights. Libya, ongoing civil war and proxy war. Gulf monarchies, they increased social welfare, put in superficial reforms, but nothing has changed, and they're still monarchs, and I don't think they in any way represent themselves as a democratic government. And then Tunisia, I'm trying to be optimistic, and I'm saying it's a fragile, ongoing transition to democracy, notwithstanding what we've seen in the last couple months, although what happened to Tunisia just shows that how difficult it is, right, just to even have a small democratic state in the Middle East. And I think that warrants its own examination because it just shows that there's many forces at play. And also just to keep in mind that the monarchs, to the extent they've made some reforms, they intentionally create these weak and dysfunctional parliaments that can be political cover or scapegoats for monarchies to blame when there are real economic and social problems. Also, elections have been used to legitimize authoritarian regimes. So this fetish for elections that Americans have, I think really needs to be put to rest. And it's much more than elections. Yes, we need free and fair elections. That's the key word. But elections are not the be all end all. And we learned that, right, with the Arab Spring. It was on full display. And then finally, lawfare is a tool that both democratic and authoritarian regimes use. So the solution isn't also simply by relying on the law, because the law in Egypt, this has been done, and in Saudi Arabia, and in almost every Middle East state. It's also been done, frankly, in the US in the post 9/11 era against Muslims. But lawfare is always its own challenge when dealing with democratization. Okay, so the theme is global competition in the Middle East. So here's kind of my very broad brush macro analysis. I think that the priorities remain, again, these are not the exclusive priorities in the United States, is to continue to have access to energy resources. We are not at the point where we're going to be energy independent or the alternative energy sources where there's a long way to go on that. We want military bases or the government, the US government wants military bases and continued political hegemony in the region. And the US wants to protect Israel. That is no secret that is a primary foreign policy goal. And democracy promotion is a political cover for military and political intervention in the post-Cold War era. So I think we've put to rest and finally the fraud of this so-called democracy promotion initiative under Bush and the neoconservatives. I don't think it was genuine and authentic. I think it was just cover. Make Russia great. Now let's look at Russia. So as we know, Putin has used, among other mottos, make Russia great again. And I think that we shouldn't underestimate, his focus on two things. One, his domestic popularity, which is the priority of any governor, but particularly of authoritarian governors, and then political hegemony over and averting democracy in what he calls the near abroad, right, which is the former Soviet Union, and he opposes Westernism. And that is really the top priority, I think, from a foreign relations perspective of Russia. The political scientists, I've yet to see something, and I'm not a political scientist, but I've been reading the literature, they claim that Russia is not pursuing an international authoritarian promotion project that mirrors the US neoconservative so-called democracy promotion, that Russia is really focusing more on its strategic interests, and it is not some kind of an ideological agenda to spread authoritarianism. And so I think we just need to be thinking about that when examining their intervention in the Middle East. Similarly, China wants to continue its very rapid and exponential domestic economic growth, which obviously expands into international economic growth from international economic activity. Access to energy and natural resources, especially in Africa, we've seen China, while the US was obsessed with the Middle East and essentially creating or intervening or contributing to multiple conflicts, China was expanding into Africa. And that's its own conversation, but I think it's no secret, or I think it's not that debatable, that one of their objectives is that access to large amounts of energy and natural resources for their economic growth. And then they certainly want to preserve regional stability in Asia and consider themselves that is their rightful place to be the hegemon in Asia. But we've seen what's been happening with the South Asia Seas, and that's where we get a little bit of South China Sea, where we get some of the military interventions. And then they want to foster geopolitical and material interests in order to strengthen the prospect of their own regime. So again, or the survival of their own regime. So again, they're also still primarily at this point focused internally. But then there are debates as to have they started to transition to more external interest internationally, or politically. Now, finally, I think that China, or based on the analysis that I've been reading as well, is that it is an ambitious player in the existing international order, but not seeking to upend the order. And that's important, especially when we're thinking about the former Cold War politics. There doesn't seem to be any evidence that they're trying to completely radically change the order. I think they just want to win and be the winners in the existing game. Okay, now Russia and the Middle East. I just essentially wanted to highlight some of the facts that influence Russia's foreign policy, both in the Middle East and again in what they call the near abroad. Just keep this in mind. In 2019, Western European countries and Turkey accounted for approximately 77% of exports from the Russian company Gazprom, while Central European states took 23%. And as we know, natural gas is a significant, if not the largest, source of external revenue. So this is a large geopolitical economic interest that will drive Russia's foreign policy, including in the Middle East. Now, again, I don't know if you believe this, but I thought this was an interesting quote that Sergei Ivanov in 2008, he was a key political ally of Putin, and I realize this is a while back. stated that we don't export ideology anymore, we only export goods and capital. But again, the literature doesn't seem to support the political science literature that Putin is doing what the former Soviet Union did in terms of the objectives for the interventions in the region. And then just to note that he has been strengthening diplomatic relations as far back as 2005 and to 2007 with a diplomatic flurry. And interestingly, Putin at least claims that he distinguishes between Islamic fundamentalism and Islamic extremism. And that's important when thinking about Middle East politics and the contrast with the US, that doesn't seem to know the difference, right, between Muslim Brotherhood, Salafi, Wahhabi, religious Muslim, and I think that's caused a lot of disastrous US foreign policy in the region. But Putin says, I don't have a problem with Islamic fundamentalism, I just have a problem with Islamic extremism, which of course is curious in light of the way that he's been treating the Chechens, but he claims that they're extremists and he doesn't have a problem with religious fundamentalist Muslims. But ultimately, he seeks to be an essential regional interlocutor. He wants to stay relevant in the region. Okay, just quickly, kind of Russia's, again, big picture activities in the Middle East. He obviously, Putin and Russia saved, I mean, this is my position, and again, people disagree, that they saved the al-Assad regime. And because from the US, the Gulf states were actively funding the militias that were opposing al-Assad and the US Syrian military. And so Russians' interference was dispositive. Now, interestingly, in Libya, Russia abstained from the UN resolution of 1973 of 2011, approving the no-fly zone over Libya. And as a result, right, Gaddafi was ultimately deposed because had Russia vetoed, then the resolution could not have gone through because they, as we all know, they're among the 5 that you cannot have a veto from those 5 to have the UN resolution pass. And now, notably, at that time, Russia was seeking support for entry into the World Trade Organization, which it actually entered in 2012, and it wanted a New START treaty with the US. So it has its own, again, domestic interests. Turkey, Russia has interest in developing Turkey as an energy hub for Russian gas to supply the Turkish market, which as we saw is a large market, and as a route to Southern Europe in terms of the market. And then finally with Iran, it was in alliance with Iran on Syria, and it has a common interest with Iran in reducing American power in the region. It supports maintaining the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and it collaborates with Iran on stabilizing, I put in parentheses, Southern Caucasus and Central Asia, again, the near abroad. So we're seeing all these policies fitting into the broader agenda that is, again, not about exporting authoritarianism or necessarily actively supporting authoritarianism, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be held accountable, right, for supporting it. I'm just trying to explore, I'm exploring why they're doing these things. And then let's look at China. All right, so the literature seems to, at least the conclusions now, I think the analysis is going to change, is that China is more neutral than Russia, and that China is really just trying to grow itself economically and gain influence in Africa. Now, here are a couple things in terms of human rights, and I'm going to let Sarah Lee Whitson, I know she's going to focus a lot more on human rights. But China did sell weapons to the Sudanese regime that was committing genocide in Darfur, and it did try to temper international sanctions. But under international pressures in advance, again, of the 2008 Beijing Olympics, China persuaded Khartoum to accept a peacekeeping force that included Chinese peacekeepers. So again, this isn't about a commitment to human rights. This is about realpolitik self-interests of their own, particularly domestically. In Libya, China voted for sanctions against Libya and in favor of referring Muammar al-Gaddafi to the International Criminal Court. It did not block a UN security resolution authorizing military intervention in Libya that ultimately led to his ouster. However, it did not have the same position when it came to Syria. It did veto the UN security resolutions to provide humanitarian aid to Syrian refugees. And in fact, it vetoed 14 UN security resolutions related to Syria alongside Russia. So there's, I mean, we can have analysis as to why they suddenly changed, but they have emphasized in their public statements is that the international community must fully respect Syria's sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity. So again, you can see that as a support for authoritarianism, but I think it's really just more a support for the state and the sovereignty of the state. And in light of what's been happening with their atrocious human rights records against the Uyghurs, they have their own interest in not having people intervene on human rights and not having a UN security resolution, or at least a UN General Assembly resolution against them. And then finally, Iran is China's third largest energy supplier. So just let that register in terms of how that's going to affect that relationship. And US Arab states, as a result, the US is trying to influence and is trying to encourage the Arab states to boost oil exports to China in order to decrease that reliance on Iranian soil. Again, this is very superficial, but I just want to, again, I'm just highlighting the key points. Now, notwithstanding that, one of the critiques against China is the unconditional loans that it gives to authoritarian regimes. Now, the question is, are they doing that to support the authoritarian regimes, or are they doing that because they have their own interests of having access to energy and having access to, I'm running out of time, so let me quickly go through this, and having their own economic dealings. They also, as Professor Hashemi stated, they export surveillance and censorship technologies to authoritarian regimes. They do not in any way feel obligated not to do so. And of course, some of it makes sense because of what they do in their own country. But they have sold artificial intelligence powered facial recognition technology to Iran. They sold technology that helps some of the Gulf states create what they call safe cities, which is essentially a network of surveillance cameras throughout the entire city. They've sold drones to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates at times when the US would not sell them the drones. And so the alleged critics or those who are suspicious of China's long game intentions of global hegemony, those who may think there is a post-Cold War light coming, is they believe what it does is it funds nations, developing nations, to build up their basic infrastructure. They add their technological systems, and then they're going to launch bilateral military cooperation with these countries, and ultimately expand their influence beyond just Africa and beyond just the economics. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to show you one thing, because this is where I don't know what the future lies for the US, because we cannot underestimate the role of the military industrial complex, right? We've spent $8 trillion, our taxpayer dollars, on, this is from the Cost of War by Brown University, on the war on terror, right? For the last 20 years. And these people want to continue to get paid. And based on, let me just show you this. 1/3 to 1/2 of them, of these funds, go to private contractors. So I can go into detail later, but finally, I'll just end to say, where does this leave the Middle East? Will it just be will they be buffer states against Chinese expanding influence politically, militarily, economically? And what will be the future of the military-industrial complex and endless conflicts in the Middle East? Because I don't think they're just going to disappear. Thank you very much. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Fascinating. One of the great things about being online and having the Zoom recording is that folks will be able to go back and look at those fantastic slides you had and ponder them. I want to get copies as well. So thank you very much. So we now turn the mic over to Sarah. Thank you.
Hi, thanks everyone, and thanks to the Arab Center for organizing this discussion. I want to try to supplement some of the comments made by my colleagues this morning to focus a little bit on the situation of democracy in the Middle East, and to focus in specifically on US policy in the Middle East and how that affects the global competition with Russia and China, because I think that's actually where it has a lot more relevance. The absence of democracy and human rights in the region are more prominent than ever before. We have reached a stage where there is, in fact, no true democracy in the Middle East at all. We have now seen a coup in Tunisia, and I remain quite disappointed that more of us have not been calling a spade with the promised suspension of the constitution. I think we've seen a quite serious blow on top of the measures already taken there in the coup. In Israel, I think there's no more pretense that the mini democracy within the expired Green Line qualifies as a democracy, given the apartheid rule over millions of Palestinians who have no vote, no equal rights under Israeli rule. Lebanon has become a failed state, and sectarian rule, of course, means there was never more than a pretense of democracy. Interesting that Iraq and Iran are now closer contenders as democracies in the region, in that at least we don't know who the president or prime minister will be in advance of an election. And there's some semblance of political competition in those countries. Tiny bright light in Qatar, where elections will be held for the first time for at least some kind of elected body, though of course the main power remains vested in the emir. And so there you have the snapshot of the closest contenders for democratic rule in the Middle East, and it's a pretty dismal picture. Now, despite President Biden's promise to make democracy a central platform of his administration globally, as distinct and superior to Russia and China by virtue of its advantages, freedom, ingenuity, respect for rights, these are the platforms on which President Biden is selling America's competition against Russia and China. There's been no change in America's policy towards the region, which has really been profoundly undemocratic and has continued to support pliant American proxies. And there has been no serious reexamination of the claimed American interests that serve to justify our continued support for unelected, unaccountable, authoritarian, and apartheid governments in the region. Egypt is but one example. Last night, it was reported that the Biden administration has in fact waived the conditions imposed by Congress on a small fraction of the military aid that we gift to Egypt's dictatorship, $1.3 billion. By now, in an act of theater, maintaining a tiny block on 110 million, I think it is, 130 million rather, on some new narrow conditions that are in fact the same old conditions that Secretary Tillerson had imposed and failed to achieve progress on under the Trump administration. I think this waiver on the block and military aid to Egypt comes as a shock to some, but sadly not to me, as I think there's been no reason at all to believe that America's policy in the Middle East under the Biden administration would shift in the Middle East, notwithstanding President Biden's promise to end the blank check for Egypt. Apparently, President Sisi is still our favorite dictator. 30 years of billions in military support to successive tyrannical regimes in Egypt. And now we have more repression and abuse under Sisi than ever seen in Egypt's history. And yet American support for this dictatorship continues with what are stale, outdated excuses to justify this military aid as somehow essential for American security. All of these arguments about American security being predicated on billions in military assistance to the Egyptian government are frankly canards that are not deserving the close scrutiny and rethink that they deserve. The notion that we need to provide military aid to Egypt so that it can have peace with Israel is one such canard, as if Egypt and Israel are not already allied and don't have stronger alliance between them than they may have with our country. The notion that we have to pay over $1 billion a year to obtain preferential access to the Suez Canal or overflight rights that can't be paid for the way we pay for other access to the Suez Canal. To great fanfare these past few months, we've seen an orchestrated show of Egypt as an essential security partner in helping to end the conflict in Gaza. But in fact, America stopped efforts to end the conflict in Gaza with 4 blocked ceasefire resolutions at the UN Security Council. If the US had wanted to end the conflict in Gaza, it had ample opportunity to do so, and certainly did not need Egypt to secure a ceasefire. As I wrote recently, I think that Egypt is an important case study as to why conditioning a portion of American military assistance to Egypt on so-called human rights reforms doesn't work, has never worked, and is still not working. And I want to use this opportunity to emphasize to our audience, to those of us in the advocacy community who are focused on Middle East policy, that advocacy that centers calls for conditioning aid contributes to the harm of America's military support for Egypt or to other abusers in the region by propagating twin myths that Egypt or the relevant abusive government is capable or willing to reform, and the United States is interested in reform. Egypt had to make a show of some minimal farcical concessions like the National Human Rights Strategy it unveiled last week, but a close look reveals this new strategy as one that actually enhances surveillance and expands censorship in the name of human rights. Israel is another place where we've seen no real change in US policy, despite the rhetoric from the Biden administration that even repeatedly breathed the words equal measures of rights and freedoms for Palestinians and Israelis in the first few months of the administration. I think that's now been downgraded to equal measures of security and prosperity. It's almost as if the Gaza war was a gauntlet thrown down by Israel to force President Biden to show his unquestioning commitment to Israel, and show it he did with $750 million in sales during the conflict, a $1 billion replenishment of military aid to Israel for the amount it spent in the Gaza war, and of course the 4 blocked ceasefire resolutions. So yes, there have been moves to reopen a consulate in Jerusalem, but it has little significance beyond, at best, a partial return to the awful status quo under Obama and prior administrations, committed to the handy unicorn of a 2-state solution and a fictional peace process. And of course, note that the Biden administration has not revoked the America's recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, nor has it revoked Trump's recognition of Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara, which the United States offered up to them as a reward for their mini-Abraham Accord with Israel. The Gulf states as well, more of the same. Defensive weapon sales continue. President Biden's cute little wordplay to avoid fulfilling his actual promise to end all arms sales to Saudi Arabia, no sanctioning of Mohammed bin Salman, the red carpet rolled out for Mohammed bin Salman's stand-in, his brother Khalid bin Salman, in Washington, D.C. So yes, some Patriot missiles and some other defenses have been withdrawn. The best possible reading as a smack on the wrist for Saudi's continued intransigence on Yemen. But frankly, Saudi Arabia can obtain these and has already started obtaining these defense systems elsewhere. Why should it have them for free from the US? The Biden administration also approved a massive arms deal to the UAE, despite its complete absence of democracy within its country, of course, but also its nefarious meddling in the region, which is ongoing in Yemen, reaching as far as thousands of miles away in Libya, where the UAE continues in flagrant violation of the UN Security Council sanctions resolutions to provide arms and military support to the warlord Khalifa Haftar. I think the harms to the people of the region of America's policy of support for dictatorships, authoritarian governments in the Middle East are clear to any observer. Our political, military, and diplomatic support contributes to the human rights abuses in the region and the misery, the suffering, the injury, and death of millions living under autocratic rule there. This breaches not only international laws prohibiting states from contributing to human rights abuses, but also unenforced American laws prohibiting arms transfers to abusive governments. The harms to our own country's interests are always underestimated. Our people remain hated for our government supports for terrible abusers. Our credibility and support is wasted to boot. But now it's an even more dire threat. And here I circle back to Biden's own stated goal for democracy promotion as a competitive edge vis-a-vis Russia and China. If we can't distinguish our democracy and our respect for rights as to why our system of governments is superior, then what is it exactly that we're offering the world as our advantage? Our effort, President Biden's effort, to make democracy the linchpin of our competitive edge over Russia and China, because certainly it's not an economic competitive edge, that effort will fail when our policies in the Middle East drive a truck through our supposed values and commitments to democracy. I think the wrong focus is to present this as an issue of competition for domination with Russia and China in the Middle East. I think we buy into the same thinking of the Middle East as some kind of chessboard, where we should be focused on who is winning the contest to dominate the Middle East. I don't think that it will be satisfying or in any way really actually relevant whether it's Russia or America or China that's dominating and controlling the autocrats and puppets in the Middle East. I think that's a distraction from where our focus should be, which is on the harms of US policy in the region and why it's actually harming our global competition with Russia and China. The good news, and I do want to offer some good news, is that President Biden made these promises to the American people, made the promise that he was going to end the blank checks to Egypt, made the promise that he was going to make Saudi Arabia the pariah that it is, that he would end arms sales to Saudi Arabia, because he knew that's what the American people wanted to hear, and that's what the American people want. The American people don't want our government to arm a president who's massacred over 1,000 protesters in a single day, or a sadistic crown prince who butchered a journalist because he was critical of him. Biden has broken his promises, and foreign policy remains in the control of the defense industry and foreign government lobbyists, which exposes the deep corruption of our own democracy. But the mood of the public on these issues has shifted enough to move Congress to issue bipartisan legislation to halt sales to Saudi Arabia at a moment when there could be no bipartisan consensus on virtually anything else in the US Congress, and enough even to shift American public opinion on the sacred cow of sanctions on Israel and America's unconditional support on Israel. So I do think there's room for our advocacy, our work, and our voices to have some opportunity to move our field policies on the Middle East. We are not interested in seeing one dominant party over another in a global contest to control the Middle East. We really do want to promote democracy for the people of the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's good to end on a few relatively positive observations. I appreciate that. Ken, you now have the mic.
Okay, well, thank you. Good to see everybody. My thanks to the Arab Center for convening this discussion, and I'm honored to serve on this panel with my fellow panelists. I want to start off a bit contrarian and challenge the premise of this panel, in that I think that the role of China and Russia in the Middle East is overstated. There is this view that the U.S. somehow is, withdrawing from its global role because of the Afghanistan withdrawal. In fact, I think Biden just recognized that the forever war in Afghanistan was going nowhere. It means an end, at least for this administration, for trying to nation build by using the military. But it doesn't necessarily mean an end to using its diplomatic or economic clout. Whether it's willing to do that is a different matter, but that's a very different matter from the military decision that was taken in Afghanistan. Probably the decision in Afghanistan does not even mean an end to the possibility of US military force, say, to protect Taiwan. Sadly, it doesn't mean an end yet to the so-called global war on terror. So I think that this withdrawal on the part of the US is overstated. Similarly, I think it's a bit overstated that, China and Russia are the key to everything here. Yes, China has money, It's a place where you can sell things. It mainly purchases natural resources from the rest of the world. Yes, it extends aid, but really that's mainly loans, not just handing over cash. It's $1 trillion Belt and Road Initiative is these days largely seen as a debt trap. These loans supposedly have no strings attached, meaning that the usual World Bank conditions for transparency and accountability are not there. But there are many strings attached in terms of the need to kind of back Beijing as it tries to stop international scrutiny of, say, its atrocities in Xinjiang, its crimes against humanity there. Certainly, there are ties in terms of having to take Chinese workers rather than local workers. So while this is an attractive loan program for the autocrats of the world, it's much easier to siphon off a portion of the loan. It's not necessarily attractive to the people of the region. I agree with Nader that Middle East and North African dictators like the Chinese model. They share an interest in stymieing efforts to enforce human rights standards, but not in any sense because this is good for their people. The best example of that is the way China is treating Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims. It shows that an autocratic government serves itself primarily and can be disastrous for its people. The fact that the Organization of Islamic Cooperation has formally endorsed the atrocities in Xinjiang is really more a product of Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. Pakistan because it was bought off by Beijing, Saudi Arabia because it has a very similar interest in suppressing human rights enforcement. But there is an interesting growing number of moderate OIC states who have been abstaining from the Chinese periodic effort to defend its practices in Geneva and New York. And indeed, some are joining with the Western effort to condemn those practices. With respect to Russia, its influence, frankly, is mainly military. It was the main factor, has been noted in, preventing the fall of the Assad government. So Russian forces joined in the mass atrocities, the targeting of hospitals and schools and markets and the like. In Libya, of course, Russia has backed Haftar. So there's a willingness to actually use military force that has become rare these days. Yesterday, Putin and Assad met in Moscow. But apart from these limited areas, I don't see Russia as being a big factor. It's not as if Russia is going to protect Saudi Arabia from a potential Iran invasion. It's not as if Russia is going to really replace the U.S. as the principal monetary backer of the Sisi dictatorship in Egypt. And even in Syria, which has been the primary Russian involvement, there's been a limit to how far it would go. Turkey basically stopped it by fighting back, which is something that nobody had done so far. That, coupled with economic and diplomatic pressure from foremost Merkel and Macron, led to the March 2020 ceasefire in Idlib, which has protected 3 million civilians, has largely stayed in place to this day. But it shows that Russia didn't really want to fight against a modern military. It was mainly there to bomb largely defenseless civilians on the ground. Now, the other place where Russia's played a nefarious role in Syria has to do with cross-border humanitarian assistance, mainly again for the areas of northern and northeastern Syria where Assad's forces do not control the terrain. Here, Russia's used its threat of a Security Council veto to gradually diminish the number of cross-border openings and to build up the legitimacy of the Assad government, to pretend that it's the appropriate interlocutor for aid, even though the Assad government has shown that it siphons off a huge amount of that aid for its military efforts or for its cronies, and that it systematically deprives aid from civilians in areas held by the armed opposition. So all of that to say that I actually don't see across most of the region China and Russia playing anywhere near the role of the United States. And so the main competition that I see for US policy in the Middle East is not global competition, but competition within the United States. It's just domestic politics. And here, Biden has been a disappointment. We were all happy that he talked about his human rights policy being guided by human rights, or his foreign policy being guided by human rights, that human rights are supposedly central to his foreign policy. But if you look at the reality, it's been considerably short of that. Here, I'm going to cover some of the same terrain that Sarah Lee just did. But let me just note that in Egypt, for example, which I think is the foremost illustration, it's going through the worst period of repression in its modern history. Tens of thousands of political prisoners, routine torture. Human Rights Watch just issued a report last week on these so-called shootouts, which are really summary executions of suspected members of the Muslim Brotherhood. But despite this horrendous human rights record, Biden just effectively threw out the human rights conditions that have been attached to a tiny part of the US military assistance. So already $1 billion of the 1.3 billion was going to go forward without any conditions. 300 million had human rights conditions attached, but rather than abiding by those conditions, rather than living up to his promise of no more blank checks for Trump's favorite dictator, Biden, basically fudged it. He split the difference. He said he wouldn't even insist on all 300 million stopping because the human rights conditions were not met. He let 170 million go forward and imposed, new modest conditions on the remaining 130 million, basically an end to a case against human rights groups and the dropping of charges against 16 people. So, far less than an end to the severe repression that the Egyptian people are today suffering. Now, why is this? As has been noted, Egypt, plays up its role as an interlocutor with Hamas in Gaza. It plays up its role as a combatant against terrorism, even though it, largely fuels terrorism through its severe repression. For the European Union, it plays up its role curtailing immigration. And so, what we have is really, we've gone from Sisi, from him being Trump's favorite dictator to his being Biden's, useful dictator, pretty much more of the same. I should just note parenthetically that, other major governments have been not a whole lot better. France, which depends on arms sales to maintain what it sees as its national, the importance of an independent arms industry. The French foreign minister, Le Drian, has been to Egypt something like 16 times. This past December, they literally rolled out the red carpet for Sisi when he visited Paris, gave him the Légion d'honneur, the highest French award, this for this brutal dictator, because he's a purchaser of French arms. At the UN Human Rights Council, despite the repression, Egypt still has never had a formal resolution passed against it. The closest we've gotten was a joint statement issued this past March by 32 governments led by Finland. The first such statements in 2014, just after the Rabat Square massacre. So, other governments have not been terribly good on this. And of course, there's the Saudi and Emirati role in this as well, where they share with Sisi a fear of electoral Islam. They all know that, the Muslim Brotherhood won the last reasonably fair election in Egypt. And they all share an interest in treating electoral Islam as the same as Islamic extremism, and just suppressing it all as, one step removed from terrorism. The Emiratis, the Saudis obviously don't want electoral Islam. They don't want elections at all. And Sisi doesn't want an election where the Muslim Brotherhood are able to compete because they might well beat him. So, all of this adds up to, a very disappointing Western response, of which Biden is a central point. Let me just touch briefly on Israel, which Sarah Lee also mentioned. I want to note that, while Biden did lift the Trump sanctions on the International Criminal Court, imposed because the prosecutor had the audacity to investigate Israeli abuses, Israeli war crimes in Palestine, and possibly US torture in Afghanistan. So, Biden lifted those sanctions, but still opposes ICC investigations in both of those situations. Regarding the recent conflict in Gaza, Biden called for de-escalation, but wouldn't go so far as to challenge, for example, the Israeli bombardment of the 4 large towers, the office apartment complexes, one of which included Al Jazeera and AP, buying into the thin Israeli pretext that there was some Hamas presence there, as if that's enough to justify the destruction of this massive civilian property. That stands in contrast even with other leading US political leaders, such as Robert Menendez, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee chair, who said he was deeply troubled by reports of Israeli military action that resulted in the death of innocent civilians in Gaza, as well as Israeli targeting of the buildings that house the international media outlets. Or for that matter, Gerald Nadler, in the House, who, on behalf of all the Jewish members of the House, said, we are horrified by the loss of dozens of Palestinian civilian lives in Gaza. Nothing like that from Biden. There, of course, was no UN Security Council resolution on Gaza until afterwards. Finally, a statement came out, which is typical of the US approach to the Security Council on Israel, with the brief exception of the end of his term, where Obama allowed, by abstaining, allowed a resolution to go through on the Israeli settlements. Biden says that he supports the two-state solution, but won't discuss the reality on the ground, the apartheid, the fact that the peace process is dead. This standing in contrast with, for example, Francis Le Drian, who said that the risk of apartheid is high. If Israel continues to act according to a single state logic, you'll have apartheid. Indeed, he says the status quo produces that already. So the real tests, for Biden on Israel are going to be, will he allow the UN Security Council to act again on the illegality of the settlements the way Obama did? Will he, as a likely new member of the UN Human Rights Council, allow it to vote, to support votes on Israel? Typically, the US says, there are too many resolutions on Israel and they're on this special agenda item solely about Israel. Well, the answer to that is have one consolidated resolution under a regular agenda item. Will the US support that? So far, no indication of that. Finally, let me just briefly mention Saudi Arabia, which Sarah Lee also got into. Obviously, there have been no sanctions imposed on the Crown Prince because of the Khashoggi murder, even though a US intelligence report said he approved the murder. Biden did release the FBI report on the 9/11 hijackers' association with two Saudis, including one diplomat, but it wasn't exactly conclusive about whether there was senior level official Saudi involvement. The US government suspended so-called offensive arms to Saudi Arabia, but particularly fighter jets and drones, because of the persistent killing of Yemeni civilians. But they allowed essentially the same package to go through to the UAE, despite, until very recently, the UAE having been a central member of the Saudi-led coalition, and despite the fact that UAE forces on the ground continue to commit atrocities. So for me, the bottom line is that, yes, Biden has been a big rhetorical improvement on Trump. We no longer have a US president who is overtly cozying up to dictators. We no longer have the embarrassment of Trump, or the president, meeting in the White House with the Saudi Crown Prince, essentially saying that US jobs are more important than Yemeni civilian lives. We have Biden saying the right thing about being guided by human rights, being central to his foreign policy. But when push comes to shove, when you look at what he's actually done so far, it's hard to see much of a difference. It's largely a continuation of the status quo that, involved Trump. It really goes back many years before that. So, for me, this is not a matter of competition from China or Russia. It's about Biden. And so far, he's largely failed the test that he himself set up for him to meet. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ken. I actually share many of your views. I'm really taken by almost the obsession that you see now in Washington on the Russia-China question. And it should raise this question: what explains this kind of emergence of this recession? What purpose or what does it serve? Because it seems, particularly in the Middle East, to misinterpret the actual sources of support for autocracy, which are largely from the U.S. and the United States. But I'm going to just put out two questions, which actually sort of echo a bunch of questions that we already had, and anybody can jump in. For Nader. Yes, the Abraham Accords, but let's think about it counterfactually. If the Accords weren't there, would U.S. policy be any different? I mean, is this really a crucial thing, a crucial explanation? Is it as important as some folks would make it out to be? I just wonder, because I just think that if you look at the situation, and those Accords weren't there, we wouldn't be dealing with a terribly different situation to begin with. And so then the second question, which also echoes questions that are up on the question and answer email, is what really is ultimately at the core of the survival of regimes in the region? Is it US external support, or is it the calculation of political leaders and the fact that they are sometimes able to draw support for their policies from specific constituencies. I'm thinking here on that, in that regards, in the case of Tunisia, it doesn't seem that Kais Saied's actions are in any respect a result of outside interference, yet we have a process which could be leading to a significant dismantling of the progress that Tunisia has made. So where does the real, analytically speaking, where does the real balance of cause and effect lie in terms of the survival of these regimes? I know that's a question that we could have an entire conference about, but we're sitting here trying to evaluate both the US and Chinese and Russian influence. And I wonder sometimes whether we ultimately are not looking at the actual sources of regime survival, although obviously US support plays an important role. So first, Nader, my question about the Abraham Accords, which as you noted are being celebrated today, but are we giving them more importance than they really merit?
Yeah, Dan, thanks for your question. I agree. There is a sense of the Abraham Accords being overstated. I mean, if the Accords hadn't happened, I don't think in any way U.S. foreign policy would have shifted in any way. I was really just commenting on what I observed to be sort of a shared consensus across the U.S. foreign policy establishment, celebrating these Accords as a major step forward. And this, at least rhetorically, I think will give some people another reason why we have to support these authoritarian regimes, because to do so is to keep alive these Accords. But I don't think it's a game changer in any way. Your second question is much more important. That has to do with the sources of authoritarian resilience in the region. Are they external or are they internal? I think it's clearly both. I mean, anyone who thinks that if we were to cut off support for the dictatorship in Egypt, that the regime would fall tomorrow doesn't understand what's going on in Egypt. But I think the more important point here in terms of sources of support for authoritarianism is really the ethical and moral question. We are responsible as American taxpayers for the consequences of our tax dollars and our policies. So in those countries where we are supporting authoritarian repression, then I think we have much more responsibility to play a constructive role in terms of the predictable consequences that flow from that type of support. And that's where the big concern is from my perspective.
Great, thank you very much. I welcome comments on those questions from anybody, any member of our panel who wants to. Sahar, jump in.
Yeah, I'll just add. So I think your question with regard to what props up dictators, it's the $1 million question we're all trying to figure out.
Yeah.
I think we all know it's very country specific. And I agree that it's both domestic and external. And the country specific is much more even domestic. But where I think the external support does make quite a bit of difference is selling weapons to the domestic security. Mm-hmm. Because the authoritarians won't necessarily disappear without external support, but they won't last. And we saw that with the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was something we all knew who studied the region, and we know it's coming. There will be another round. There'll be something is bound to happen. We don't know when, and we don't know how. We don't know how bloody it is. But the current situation is not sustainable if the external support wasn't there. And that external support, again, is selling weapons, selling surveillance, and AI intelligence, surveillance equipment, software, military intervention, which we saw again in Syria and in Libya, at least when we were trying to get rid of Gaddafi, and also the protection from accountability in the international community. So the veto of a Security Council resolution, or the refusal to, the protection. Essentially what we did, for example, with Mohammed bin Salman is just the fact that Trump and his administration protected him was in itself a way of supporting him, that we don't know what would have happened without that and how long he would have lasted, because he's got quite a bit of internal enemies who are very eager to get rid of him. And similarly, we don't know if there could be a military coup in Egypt, right? Because part of the analysis is when they leave, who replaces them, and then what's the next phase. So all that is to say that I do think that the external factors are significant. One issue I just wanted to respond to Ken. I don't think that the Middle East will be irrelevant, although sometimes I really wish it would become irrelevant to the US so that it could develop without so much intervention and so that its people could have more autonomy. I think it's the US's obsession with the Middle East that is causing so many problems for the people there. But the question is, what will the motivations be? What are the motivations? You know, the 9/11 attacks gave three administrations a very long leash of 20 years thus far to have an excuse to intervene in these various ways. And so the question now is, are we moving beyond the war on terror post 9/11 era into a new era that just simply gives the US a different motivation, just like the Cold War era gave it a different motivation, which then will affect how it will intervene and to what extent?
Thank you very much. Anybody else wish to pipe in? Sarah, please.
Yeah, I just to add to the points made on the Abraham Accords, you know, I think you're right sort of to question whether it would be any sort of a game changer if these accords didn't exist. I think what's notable about them, though, is the localized harm, localized danger that these accords have subjected the people of the region to. The US government forced the Transitional Council in Sudan to accept the Abraham Accords with Israel in exchange for getting removed from the US terrorism list, in exchange for getting over $300 million the US said it owed waived. You know, a combination of carrots and sticks in a way that is profoundly destabilizing for what was hoped to be a democratic transition in Sudan. We can expect that there will be continued fallout from Morocco's decision to be part of the Abraham Accords, although they disclaim signing it with the same robustness as the UAE and so forth. We have already seen an uptick in authoritarianism in the UAE to silence its own population with the blessing, with the green light of the United States, to silence even students on the NYU campus who tried to dare to protest. And you know, if you expand that out from the Abraham Accords to your broader question, and I think Saha was alluding to this, the US isn't just putting its finger on the scale in support of authoritarianism and tyrannical rule in the Middle East. It's putting the full weight of its political and military support behind these governments in a way that basically crushes out the opportunity for anybody else to even try to emerge. And Saudi Arabia is the best case in point. When Mohammed bin Salman first emerged, there was a sizable body of princes who opposed him and thought that Mohammed bin Nayef would make a better leader for the country. They signed a remarkable protest letter against him. The US put its full weight behind Mohammed bin Salman, crushing any opportunity for domestic opposition against him to emerge or to feel that it had a chance. So in this way, in fact, the US is not the only reason for the authoritarianism in these countries, but it provides a hell of a lot of support and makes alternatives impossible.
Absolutely. Let me just, in response also to Sarah, but also echoing a question that, and maybe this will lead us to wrap up because I see we're wrapping up at pretty shortly. And that is, I was, on the one hand, in terms of Congress support for Israel is clear. The constraints that come out of that, depending how you view them, are opportunities. But yet we have interest in Congress on the human rights issue on the Hill. I don't know if any of you read Senator Murphy's letter that he wrote after returning from his meeting with Kais Saied, which is really, I thought, remarkable statement about his experiences, but it also has an implicit sort of message. I mean, is there, when one considers the factors that are really driving US support for autocracies in the region, it seems very grim indeed. What are the possibilities that that putting aside the question of Israel Congress, yet we have pockets of support that could be quite significant in Congress for sort of rethinking these relationships. Does that make a difference? Can it make a difference? What can be done to enhance the leverage from both parties? Because sometimes these things are bipartisan in ways that are quite striking, particularly these days. So I just wonder, in the name of positive thinking, what anybody thinks about that particular question.
Dan, I mean, I think you're right that there is much more room in Congress than the Biden administration seems to be using to change U.S. policy toward the Middle East. And we saw that already with Saudi Arabia, where clearly there's no love lost from Mohammed bin Salman. I think something similar could be done with Egypt, even though Sisi does a very good job of kind of playing the Hamas card or the counterterrorism card. But as Sarah Lee went through, these are really not persuasive arguments. I think what the Saudis and the Emiratis did in Yemen appalled many people. Now the Emiratis have now somewhat divorced themselves from that, but not entirely on the ground. They're just not participating in the bombing anymore. But I do think, we had hoped that Biden would be leading on some of these things. He's not. But I do think that there's room within Congress to press him. And frankly, even on Israel, we know that, Congress has been extremely reluctant to act, but we've now had, a number of quite leading senators and members of the House who have been willing to at least say things that they never used to say. And that's the beginning of an opening. So I think we need to exploit congressional possibilities as Biden seems to be moving down a much more traditionalist path.
Yeah, I just want to add on what was just said by Ken Roth that, yes, these openings in Congress are very important, very noteworthy, but let's be clear, they're coming because of a more informed citizenry that's outraged by what is being done in the name of the United States across the region. And, people are not going to take it anymore. So, Chris Murphy can say these things. Senators can speak much more critically, I think, about U.S. policy toward Israel and Palestine, because they're getting an earful of criticism from their citizens. And in that sense, there's a lot of hope that the traditional sort of foreign policy consensus where we just support these dictators, we support Israel blindly, is no longer sustainable. And so in that sense, I think there's a lot to be encouraged by. Thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to add, when I listened to Ken's comments, I kept thinking, it raises the question we always have when we're teaching students about human rights, which is, why does the US even care about human rights? And that question becomes more compelling when you look at the record, which Ken and Sarah and Ned brought up. And I think that we have to, those of us who are committed to human rights and want it to be incorporated into US foreign policy, which I don't think it has been beyond kind of a pro forma way in many decades, especially in the Middle East, is the question is, why should the US government care about human rights? And how can we make the case that it's actually in the US's best interests? Or we could just take a more kind of moral approach where it doesn't all have to be about the realpolitik interest, but it can also just be about our morals and our own values. And I think this discussion is kind of bringing that perennial issue to the forefront, and it's a challenge that we continue to face. And I wonder to what extent the few congressional leaders that are serious about supporting human rights in the Middle East, I wonder if they do it only to placate and pander to some of their constituents, but they're not really as serious because they are persuaded by the fear-based narratives that Middle East authoritarians give them, which is, if you allow democracy, the radical Islamists will take over, we'll have a civil war, it will become like the Syrian context or the Libyan context or the Afghan context. And I still am baffled as to why the US foreign policy apparatus continues to fall for these what I think are laughable scenarios. But things haven't changed, and I don't see anything changing. And I think that is really what we need to, at least the next generation of leaders, that are committed to human rights need to grapple with over the next decade or two.
Anyone else? I did want to ask Sahar, but can anybody in the panel here, we're in the title for this conference, or at least this session, the issue of democracy and human rights are placed together. And what is, in terms of US policy, and this is again a question for, I've written about this a little bit for the Arab Center, and it's a question worthy of a full conference, or at least another session. In terms of sort of gaining some sort of leverage on these issues and making a difference, is it in our interest more to focus on the issue of human rights as a democracy per se? What is the sort of link between these two? Sarah, you work for an organization which makes democracy at its core, but I think there's a question about sort of what, where do we get more leverage? When, what do people really care about? And democracy is a big word. It means different things to different people, but the term human rights has a kind of wider global sort of, I think, meaning that I think cuts across the debates about democracy. So I just wonder about, and this also echoes actually two questions that we've had about how our panelists see this issue of Ken, yeah.
Well, I mean, obviously, democracy requires respect for human rights in its many, many elements. And you can't have full respect for human rights without having democracy. So they're closely linked. I think that the problem we've had is that many governments prefer the term democracy, which they tend to equate with an election, which increasingly they've trivialized. So we've had a long process of kind of managed elections where the playing field is tilted. We now have these completely fake elections. What the Kremlin is about to do in Russia for the Duma elections. There's not even a pretense of competition there. And we're seeing that, playing out over and over again in Nicaragua right now, in Hong Kong. So, the danger with focusing too much on the term democracy, divorcing it from human rights, is that it plays into this effort to manipulate the concept. I think a real test coming up is, Biden is going to hold this democracy summit in December. And is he going to, repeat the mistake of Bill Clinton, which is basically turning it into a convention of US allies and friends? Or is he going to make the price of admission really having a democracy? And we don't know yet. We don't know what the invitation list is. But if we see the likes of Egypt or Bahrain or UAE or Saudi Arabia on that list, we'll know that this is not really a democracy summit. It's just a summit of allies.
Right. Anyone else wish to engage that? Sarah, are you tempted to?
I mean, I guess what I would just add is that at this point in time, democracy and human rights really are inseparable and need to be seen inseparably. Human rights law recognizes political participation, political association as fundamental human rights. And the expression of free political participation and free political association is a form of government known as democracy. So you really don't have any real democracy if the rights that make up democracy are respected. So I don't really think that you can talk about one meaningfully without the other.
Right, but just to play devil's advocate for a moment, if MBS had not engineered the kind of coup that in effect you talked about against its allies, we would have a Saudi Arabia that wouldn't be a democracy, but perhaps wouldn't be torturing and killing its citizens with a kind of abandon of this particular leader. And the chances are that the US will be in a position to sort of push for an actual democratization seems slim, but could we not demand even from our non-democratic allies and adherence to human rights and make that an issue that would carry some weight given the sort of geostrategic realities in the region? Or is this simply not a way to go? I thought, Sarah, your presentation suggested maybe it's not, but
I certainly don't think it's America's role to be demanding and insisting that the government of Saudi Arabia or any other government do any particular thing while it's also providing arms to them and so on. That frankly undermines the human rights mission and the human rights values by making them seem like empty words that are used in a politicized way. You know, when the US sanctions Iran for executing unjustly a political detainee, a wrestler, while it has nothing to say about executions in Saudi Arabia or mass death penalty verdicts in Egypt, undermines the human rights values. I don't want to see the US playing that harmful role. You know, as to what might have emerged in Saudi Arabia or could have emerged, certainly I think things would have been better under another prince, not one perhaps as sadistic and deranged as Mohammed bin Salman. But the absence of democracy means the absence of political freedoms. And so, no, it would still not be good if that's the counterpart to.
And
if I may just take this quickly, I mean,
it's very important. Go ahead, Ken.
I mean, obviously, if there's, you know, even an autocrat, you know, who's not in any sense a Democrat, you still want to push them on human rights. You know, it's not like you just assume everybody that's not a democracy may as well be like North Korea. You know, there are lots of variations within that. And so, you know, by all means, you should press the Saudis or the Emiratis to release political prisoners, to allow a degree of freedom. You know, ultimately you want democracy, but you know, that's maybe the end of the process. In the interim, of course, you press them on other human rights concerns.
Right. Well, thank you very much. This has been a tremendous panel. I very much appreciate the participation and the contributions of all the participants. And I think at this point, we're going to turn over the proceedings to Khalil, who is going to do some wrap up for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a 5-minute break and start with panel 2. So stay tuned. We should start around 12:05. Good morning, Dr. Talhami. We're just waiting on a few panelists here.
Great, good morning.
All right, if I can have the panelists for panel 2, turn on your videos and your mics. We're going to start as soon as I take down the banner in about 3 minutes. Dr. Talhami, as soon as you see the banner come down, you can start.
Okay, great.
If I can ask the panelists to stay muted until it's their turn to speak. Dr. Talhami, you can stay on. All right, 30 seconds.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the second panel of the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. 6th Annual Conference, examining U.S. policy and global competition in the Middle East. I'm Shibli Talhami, the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland and non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. I also serve on the board, the academic board of the Arab Center. I'm delighted to be with you today to chair this panel titled Energy Diplomacy and Geopolitical Influence in the Middle East. I'm joined by 4 outstanding experts, and many of you know them and have read them before, who will explore the changing energy and economic relations in the Middle East and the impact of geopolitical power on economic development and on US leverage in the region. They will discuss the shifting outlook toward Asia and Russia, US disengagement, and the economic activities and priorities of regional and global powers and their impact on the future of energy and economic development. Let me introduce the panelists in the order they are speaking. I'm starting off with my friend Tariq Youssef, who's a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution's Foreign Policy Program and the director of the Brookings Doha Center. His research has focused on political economy and policy reform and the dynamics of youth inclusion in the Arab world, and his current interests include post-conflict political and economic transitions. Next is Karen Young, another distinguished scholar, senior fellow, and founding director of the program on economics and energy at the Middle East Institute. She regularly teaches courses on international relations and economy of the Middle East, and is widely published and is quoted and appears frequently in the international media. Her research interests include political economy of the Middle East, energy policy, emerging markets, and economic diversification in the Gulf. Next is another outstanding scholar, Basma Momani, who is professor of political science and assistant vice president for research and international affairs in the Office of Research at the University of Waterloo. Her expertise includes Middle East politics and economics, international affairs, international financial institutions, and diversity and populism. She has published extensively and is a regular contributor to national and international media on global security and economic policy issues. And I'm sure you have seen some of her output in recent months. Finally, Camille Lons, a research associate in the Middle East office of the International Institute of Strategic Studies. Her research covers political and security developments in the Gulf region with a specific focus on Gulf countries' economic and political relations with Asian powers, and the geopolitics of ports, trade routes, and logistics infrastructures in the Gulf and Red Sea. And you'll see that she brings in a very interesting dimension to the conversation. Many thanks to all four of you for being with us today. Before I turn over to our speakers for their remarks, I want to remind the audience to submit questions. We're going to have a 1.5 hour question period from 1 to 1:30, and you can submit those on Zoom in the question and answer feature that I will then read after the speakers end their remarks. Thank you so much. Let me start with Tariq Youssef.
Good morning, or good afternoon, Shibli and everyone. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. We haven't met in person in quite a while.
Yes.
But thank you for the Arab Center for extending this invitation, bringing us together and giving us an opportunity to discuss a set of very important and critical issues. I have to admit at the outset that I've struggled a bit with the outline of this panel and the title to begin with, thinking about US energy diplomacy in a context of so much dislocation and uncertainty happening elsewhere. And now you bring in the energy, the economy, and societies at large. And thinking about US policy, I think, becomes very challenging, notwithstanding what has been discussed very amply in the previous panel about the uncertainty and immense anxiety in the region vis-a-vis where the US is heading, how the US plans to conduct itself, not only in the region, but vis-a-vis other global powers. So my remarks are going to focus on trying to provide a framework, really, for thinking about energy diplomacy and how this is likely to affect the Middle East. And as the Arab Center rightly suggested, and very appropriately, I should focus initially on perhaps taking stock of where we are in the region, as far as the economies, as far as societies, 2 years into the pandemic, and what the future holds and what we can say about it. And that's precisely what I'm going to start asking the question, or making the point, that in fact, any discussion about the future of the Middle Eastern economy, the economy covers oil, but non-oil sectors, covers labor markets, covers poverty and socioeconomic development. That understanding in 2021 must include some appreciation of what has happened in the last 2 years, the fallout from the pandemic, the economic fallout from the pandemic, or what we might call the pandemic recession, an understanding of what the fallout is, the implications, the effects, and secondly, an assessment of the recovery and how it's likely to take place, if and when, who's likely to benefit, who's likely to lose, and how the region would look. I think once you have that context, then it becomes easier to ask questions about the role of the US, the role of other powers, and how the region will evolve. I think the fallout from the pandemic recession, once we take stock of what has happened, is going to be seen to be massive. I think an immense amount of damage, scarring has taken place across the region. And this has manifested itself in ways that I think, notwithstanding the data problems and the inadequacies, we're beginning to see. I think cohorts of publics in the region, cohorts of youth, have been probably set back a decade in terms of socioeconomic development outcomes. Think of jobs, think of wages, think of livelihoods. I think poverty has taken a big shock, poverty rates, and we've seen emerging spikes across the region, affecting poverty, affecting vulnerability, affecting livelihoods, affecting, quite frankly, segments of the population that in the past had been sort of isolated from the larger economy. We've seen also glaring disparities become very, very clear. This is not just economics and wealth, it's about access to education, access to technology, access to banking. All of this suggests that, in fact, the social peace and the foundations of social peace and stability in the region that we've taken, I think, for granted, and rightly so, for a very long period of time, have been weakened, have been shaken. And governments which have tried to throw everything, especially low-income and middle-income governments, at the pandemic, have essentially come short. Social protection systems have been pushed to the brink. Social assistance was largely absent or confined to segments of the population, and bureaucracies, large, humongous, expansive, have not performed as well as we had expected. All of this, again, is to suggest that the fallout is massive. It should not be taken, it should not be underestimated, and it's going to stay with the region for a while to come. In fact, that also shapes, to some extent, the kind of recovery we should expect over the next couple of years as the world begins to emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic and associated economic effects. I think the recovery, as the IMF rightly pointed out, is going to be a long one. It's going to be a slow one. It's going to be incomplete, and it's going to be divergent, meaning the Middle East that is likely to emerge economically post-COVID is going to look very different from how it did. Keep in mind that the last decade was characterized by so many observers as being a lost decade, the post-Arab Spring decade, economically and developmentally. Add to it the massive dislocation that had taken place. Some sectors are probably never going to come back. Think of tourism, think of underpinnings of a lot of informal economies that were pushed essentially out of business. They may not recover, or they will take a very long time to recover. Governments have amassed amounts of debt to keep economies running. A lot of this debt is gonna come due on top of the debt they had in fact burdened themselves with and the economies with in the last decade, and that is going to be yet another huge challenge for most governments to manage. We're not just talking here about the rich, the poor economies. We're also talking about some countries in the Gulf Cooperation Council. Think of Bahrain, think of Oman. Everyone in many ways has been really pushed. And so both this reading of the fallout and the nature of the recovery are suggesting already to me that this time is different. Unlike previous recessions, which had taken place over the last 30 years, this is not going to be a recession where you're going to essentially push the button, the world economy recovers, and you ride. And that's partly because of other structural features, changes that are taking place within the international system that I think worth pointing out to. One is, the retreat of globalization. I think there's immense anxiety in many parts of the region about the future of the global economy. Are we in a world of economic nationalism where each country is looking after its own interests? Or are we going to find a new understanding around a global economy that is connected, interdependent, but still protects workers and protects the segments that have sort of lashed back at politicians and governments elsewhere? That uncertainty for a lot of countries that have made a bet on an open, vibrant, and growing international system, I think is a cause for concern, and one that is likely to shape the recovery. Perhaps the one that's most relevant for our panel, and I'll leave it for other panelists to cover, but it's worth noting because of its economic implications, is the energy transition, the uncertainty and the worries about the energy transition. There is a new global agenda and a new global consensus around climate change. With it comes a set of policies that directly fly in the face of interests of many of the crude exporting countries. And they're not just GCC countries. They're countries like Algeria and Iraq. They're also countries like Syria and Yemen and Libya who expect and think that post-conflict reconstruction is going to be driven by oil. Unlike previous recessions, where the recovery of oil markets acted as a very important impulse for recovery across the region. It wasn't just fiscal balances, it was aid, it was remittances, it was trade, it was foreign direct investment. The energy transition presents a fundamental shift and an immense source of uncertainty for most countries in the region, and by extension, the regional recovery. How long are we looking at in terms of the viability of crude? 10, 15, 20, 30 years? That, I think, again, makes the recession this time around and the setback from during the last couple of years different from the past, and ones where the region, on top of a host of other sources of uncertainty, is going to be looking at immense potential dislocation or continued uncertainty on what to do and how to behave. I think this context probably is an entry point for discussing where does geopolitics fit in all of this. So we're not just talking economic uncertainty about the international economic system and global competition and the economic sphere and economic nationalism. There is also global geopolitical competition, and what is happening there and what is likely to happen there. I leave it to, I think the previous panel did a great job of crystallizing these issues, and many of my colleagues will do so again. But from the perspective of those who are thinking about the economy and the energy transition, the US focus on China and Russia is going to present immense challenges to countries in the region. Russia and China have become increasingly aligned with the interests of energy exporting countries in the region by virtue of dependence on their markets or alignment around policies that aim for price stability, that aim for preserving market shares. If this energy transition accelerates, and if the US intends to confront China and Russia in energy markets, how far will the US go? And will this push countries increasingly towards China and Russia in an alignment around economic interests out of concern for livelihoods, long-term viability? I think that is an important concern. We saw an episode of this last year where, in fact, Saudi Arabia and Russia went head-to-head in a fight over prices and market share. But the US stepped in a very constructive way to try to sort of contain the damage out of concern for its own shale producers. Will the US continue to do this, or will the US realize that the increasing alignment economically around energy interdependence between parts of the Middle East and Russia and China presents energy diplomacy with the challenge of how far do you go? And will that put you in a direct confrontation with your allies in the region, who are not only uncertain about what you're doing, are anxious about your withdrawal, who are fearing probably in other ways pressures to minimize or limit your links and trade with China and Russia. We see this in the areas of telecom, defense, and infrastructure, where US economic diplomacy is pushing countries to limit their exposure. But how far will countries be willing to play along if the US, on the other hand, is also helping to accelerate an energy transition, and withdrawing and retreating from the region and creating immense security uncertainty. Last but not least are a set of issues we've inherited from before the COVID pandemic, which was regional rivalries that had flared up and, in fact, had accelerated to a degree where we saw the GCC rift, the blockade of Qatar, and the breakup essentially of the Arab world as we've known it in ways, meaning the level of fragmentation, anxiety, suspicion, competition. What happens to that as we move forward and as the US repositions itself? I worry, Shibli, and I'll try to sort of wrap my comments here. I worry that we're going to be seeing an Arab world where the fragmentation of the last decade is going to further accelerate. It's not only going to be geopolitical fragmentation and security fragmentation, but it's going to be increasingly also economic fragmentation. There's going to be a lot of economic nationalism. There's going to be a go-it-alone attitude. And we've seen glimpses of that recently. We saw it in the rift between Saudi Arabia and the UAE around their shares in OPEC. We saw it in Saudi Arabia's very robust assertion of economic national interest vis-a-vis its ally, the UAE, when it comes to the location of companies, the headquartering of companies that operate in the region, its projection of its own economic interests vis-a-vis many other countries. We see the UAE pull away also in other directions. And we've seen countries like Bahrain and Oman facing sort of a lot of isolation and being left to fend for their own economic interests. Even North Africa, where we once assumed had been immune, with the exception of Libya, to sort of the regional upheaval we saw in the last decade and the geopolitical competition, we're seeing glimpses and hints of what is likely to come. Algeria just cut off diplomatic ties with Morocco. And the Algerians are thinking that, no, what happened in Tunisia matters for us, and it's driven by what Egypt and the UAE is doing and what Morocco has done with Israel. I think the fragmentation geopolitically of the last decade is likely to give way to economic fragmentation, or fragmentation of national economic policy. And the bottom line, Shibli, this is going to make it very difficult for the US to be effective in the region. If the mantra of the Biden administration, future administration, is going to be working through alliances, trying to bring countries together, this is going to take a monumental amount of resources, energies, and time, all of which are not available in a region where the US is retreating. And as a result, we've seen the US not be able to affect the course of policy outcomes, and not only in the Gulf or the Maghreb, but in places like Yemen or in places like Libya. An absolute minimalist attitude geopolitically is not necessarily going to be compensated for with a much stronger presence on economic diplomacy or energy diplomacy. And I think that is the sense in which we're looking at a decade of a lot of uncertainty, potential turbulence, and an Arab world that I fear might find itself adrift amongst global shifts and intensifying global competition between the US and other powers. I'll stop here and look forward to the comments of my colleagues. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Tariq. That was illuminating, and you raised some really important issues, certainly about the Arab fragmentation. We've seen the emergence of the economic competition between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and that might become we might see more of that in the region down the road. With regard to the US, I'm going to ask you later on when we all conclude as perhaps a first question to follow up on the implications, what you think for the US, because one can certainly argue that these warnings really are not taken into account what the US has not gotten from the region over the past. I mean, the US has been intervening, spending trillions of dollars, lots of blood. And one can argue that in the past 20 years, instead of being in a better position, it's in a worse position globally vis-a-vis China. And so are these warnings really, can they be pushed to an analytical clarity more, because I'm not sure what is the US going to get by being more involved or continuing as it is now. So that's a question that we put in perspective, because it's assuming that the US policy and intervention in the Middle East have gotten the US something. I don't think so. I think the US has been a big loser in the past 2 decades. Karen.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me, and what a great panel to join among friends and colleagues. It's really good to see you all. I wanted to focus my remarks on thinking through how what we call the energy transition might affect oil and gas producers in the Middle East. And this is absolutely a period of disruption, of change and uncertainty. We're living through some of the most volatile energy price periods in recent history. Natural gas prices are at all-time highs, electricity demand is surging, we have supply outages, and really difficulty in seeing a smooth path for oil prices with so many unknowns in terms of the pandemic recovery, a drying up of capital expenditure and investment into oil and gas discovery and new production, and mostly a policy climate that is hostile to hydrocarbon producers, yet I would say ambivalent on how to replace them. One of the key misunderstandings in US relations with the energy producers of the Middle East has been how we are connected to each other. And the notion of America as a net oil exporter has been, I think, a confusing appendage to a larger movement towards disengagement in the region and a growing justification for restraint or isolation from the challenges of global economic stewardship. In the United States, we do produce oil and gas, but we disagree on where to produce it, federal or private lands. We're not good at transporting or refining it for domestic use. We lack a system of nationwide pipelines, and we're in opposition to neighborhood pipelines like Keystone. We also do a poor job protecting our infrastructure that is most vulnerable to climate change, as we've seen in Louisiana and the Gulf of Mexico in hurricane season, and this is likely to become a regular reality. So when our gasoline prices are high, the Biden administration tells Saudi Arabia to increase production, as if their oil wells went directly to the storage tanks under our filling stations, but it doesn't work that way. While we do need less oil to grow, we still need oil and gas. And as scholarship from Ted Erker and Christoph Ruhl has demonstrated, we, meaning mostly wealthier OECD economies, are twice as efficient in our ability to take a barrel of oil to generate $1,000 of GDP than we were in 1970. And this is because of policy innovation in how we regulate pollution, car manufacturers, appliances, and electricity use generally. The developing economies are also getting more efficient, but they will carry the bulk of new oil and gas demand in the coming decades. And this is what is influencing how oil and gas producers, especially in the Middle East, interact with their customers and future markets. More towards the east, more in high population and poor countries, and more for a rising consumer class that will buy plastics from petrochemicals, household appliances, and demand a whole lot more of electricity. So Middle East oil and gas producers know the energy business will continue to grow. So energy business meaning electricity business, especially. But even as demand for oil should plateau by about the 2030. There are a lot of ways to be in this business, including through renewable energy production and solar, and maybe even hydrogen as a transport fuel. But to get there requires capital expenditure and new investment. And this is where the rich world and the developing world have parted ways. Global energy investment, especially in oil and gas capex, fell off a cliff in 2020, going from close to $1 trillion to $500 billion. Clean energy investment in developing countries is a third of what it is in advanced economies and China. So international oil companies are under tremendous pressure to demonstrate their own divestment from fossil fuel exploration and new production. So they're largely out of that business, or finding ways to pair oil production with renewables or sustainable projects. I'll give you an example. There's a new deal signed from Total and the government of Iraq that combines new oil field production with a 1 gigawatt solar plant, with efforts to capture flaring in natural gas, and to build desalination plants. That's a great example of a concern for an IOC into its shareholder interest, but also to partner with a possible area of new oil production. So the steep decline in oil and gas CapEx has created some new inequities among oil and gas producers across MENA. So for national oil companies, some are well positioned to access debt markets and grow. They can expand their businesses along a value chain to sell off assets now in new partnerships. But these are a few, and these are in the Gulf. This is ADNOC and Aramco, and perhaps some privatization in Oman. There's some disagreement among national oil companies in the Gulf about how best to do this, but ultimately they are competing in a more narrow space that requires more attention to customers and attention to partners politically. Note also as an example, the 35-year offshore exploration concession from ADNOC to a consortium of Pakistani oil companies, including government interests. This deal is similar to the Total deal in that we're seeing governments and government entities eager to close deals and willing to be creative in their processes, but these processes are becoming inherently more prone to politics and less open. For example, the tender for the solar power plant in Iraq was a one-bidder contract. And it may be that Gulf national oil companies like Aramco and ADNOC will be well positioned as leaders in new energy sources, especially in solar electricity development and hydrogen for transport, which would ensure their dominance and revenue production for decades to come. For natural gas, this is really different. If we think about where there is energy demand and supply, Europe is energy poor, less interested in oil, and looking for gas. The LNG business is absolutely a transition fuel within the energy transition. It's cleaner to burn, but it's expensive to turn from gas to a liquid, back to gas again, and transport in between. East Med suppliers, Egypt, Israel, Cyprus, and if they were better positioned, this could be Lebanon, which really misses a window, which is closing. These suppliers must balance between trying to capitalize on their near-term gas resources while investing in regional connectivity and technology. This means pipelines, this means floating terminals, to create a longer-term energy market. But this window is closing too, because as we see in terms of carbon tax and restrictions inside the EU, it will be a short horizon. It's truly a transitional market. There's a ticking clock to avoid stranded assets and more reason for collaboration in delivery projects like pipelines. So Egypt might see more competition to avoid their export points to the Mediterranean. Other states and international oil companies are considering floating gas terminals, undersea pipelines. New investments are forthcoming. This is somewhere where IOCs are very active, and new investments also from national oil companies in the Gulf are happening, notably the UAE investment from Mubadala into the Tamar gas field, which is owned and operated by Israel. Egypt, Israel, and Cyprus appear determined to get their gas to market, yet Qatar and Russia dominate export markets to Asia. So this is really a European game. Also interesting is that the US might become a competitive exporter to the EU of LNG in the future. So within the MENA region, the reality of oil and gas producers has never been more stark. It's also more divided in outlook and opportunity. And the US has never been so disengaged from its own understanding of why the energy transition in MENA should matter to us. How the Middle East is able to deliver energy products within the region will decide which states and their investors dominate for years to come. And the states and national oil companies that achieve dominance in new energy products will dominate emerging markets, Asia and Africa, for the next several generations. And this will be largely outside of US collaboration or investment. So for Europe, managing a transitional energy supply, especially in natural gas, could mean more economic growth or absolute crisis. So for these reasons, MENA matters. What happens in energy markets in the Middle East matters. It matters to US interest, but it also matters, as Tarek mentioned, to how these states have opportunities for growth. And I think we are going to see in the next decade sharper inequities emerging between oil and gas producers within the region and shorter windows of opportunity to really access new exploration, new agreements, new opportunities to maximize profit from these resources.
You're muted, Shilpi.
Oh, sorry. I didn't realize that I was muted. I apologize. Basma next.
Thank you. So thanks, everyone. Thank you for the invitation, Arab Center. I really appreciate it. And what a great review we've already gotten from Thought and Karen. You really did get some great experts to talk about this. So just picking up on a few things, and I know Thought it talked about this a little bit, but I'll just add on if I may. I mean, there is a lot of uncertainty in the global economy. We can't ignore that. I mean, oil is about it's so intimately tied to all things that we do. So we need to talk about variables like the economic growth projections in the global economy, which are so uncertain. I mean, I don't know if others feel the same way, but I feel like the IMF has given us a very rosy picture. And often I find that there's a really clear asterisk of a caveat based on the dispersal of vaccines. And frankly, the dispersal of vaccines isn't happening, right? So it is such a big variable. At the end of the day, if economic growth stalls and continues to be a challenge, that's going to affect us in terms of the transportation of goods, because this is a capitalist world economy where consumption is what really stimulates production and therefore growth. I think even if we get back to sort of pre-pandemic levels of consumption, I don't know how many of you are following supply chains. I've become obsessed with it. I don't know why, but I can't go to a regular store of any kind and not see empty shelves. I don't know if it's a Canadian phenomena. I think it's a global one, but increasingly supply chains are very much broken. I think we're going to see an uptick in production, even domestically, even regionally, to overcome that. This idea that there will be unfettered globalization and we will get goods from China on demand, the just-in-time delivery, all of that, frankly, is in question today. I'm increasingly hearing from companies that they're going to want to resort to more local production or regional production. So for us in Canada, that's often North American production because of NAFTA or NAFTA 2.0. My point being that this idea of global trade of goods, I think, is a part of the scarring. It's a part of a permanent feature. I don't think we're going to go back. Supply chains are thorny and they don't tend to change quickly. People don't want to deal with a new supplier. So the fact that we're seeing slowly a change in companies trying to get input goods more locally, et cetera, I suspect that I think that once that happens and we see that transition take place, and it's already happening, I don't think it's going to go back to China when the pandemic ends. And certainly not with the reality that we constantly hear about, this is the beginning of many more pandemics, right? I mean, it's really hard as a business owner to plan those sorts of things. I mean, on consumption, of course, which is a big part of it. And on the industrial side, I talked about that, but I'd even argue on the personal side, right? I mean, individual consumption of oil is certainly not the highest, but car consumption is high. I mean, increasingly, we're hearing the mantra "Build Back Better." I'm sure all of you have sort of seen this slogan, first from the World Economic Forum, and now sort of everybody has one. We have a variety of it here in Canada as well. And some of that is societal. I mean, I think there are some real changes happening, right? So I already can tell you from, again, having in my own personal life as an academic, but also as an administrator at the university, people have gotten used to working from home. The concept of remote work is increasingly being internalized. This is a gender issue too for a lot of women with young kids, which make up a big part of the workforce. Say this works for us. Like, it works for us when the kids are at school. I'm caveat there, right? But so there's societal changes happening where we're talking about the hybrid office. We're not even talking about going back to the way things were. It will never go back to the way things were. We figured it out, right? I mean, with all due respect, I mean, I used to love coming to DC to all these great events, right? And I'm like, I want to get back to, the Arab Center, Washington's events. I want to go back for Brookings cookies. I mean, I loved going to those things. Do I see myself like I did before, getting on a plane to go to a meeting in Washington the same way as before when we've got Zoom, it's click, click, click? I don't know, right? So, I mean, this is the thing that I think we need to start recognizing. There are just some things that are not going to go back to quote unquote normal. I'm even seeing, I mean, my sister's a real estate agent. So if this was a local, I'd plug her, but there's no point. She's finding lots of clients who are wanting to move outside the city. I mean, it's become now an option, right? So the big thing is not even suburbs. I'm talking rural areas, countryside. People are like, oh, why should I have to live in Washington when I can, move, not even just Alexandria or or Gaithersburg and all these, but even farther away. And so that is also going to change our consumption. So my point is, I think there are some real permanent structural features in the way we operate. And lastly, I'll add, and I see this obviously in my kids and certainly in my students, the absolute commitment to the environment in a way that our generation just, I'm not saying we were terrible. Well, maybe we were, sorry, I should take that back. We were terrible to the environment. But my point being is that they really measure their footprints, if you will. And so there is some attitudinal changes towards indeed getting on a plane. The fact that I once went to China for 24 hours and came back, that would make any student in my classroom absolutely appalled, right? So this is the kind of, I think, behavioral changes, deep structural changes, societal changes that I think we're going to have to really start to think about. So this is attitudinal changes. So I don't think we're going to go back. Now, what does this mean for diplomacy? I love this quote. I actually use it in my classroom because it really stands out to me. Lawrence Korb, which I'm sure many of you know and have seen, he was also at one point the Assistant Secretary of Defense, once said at the time of the 1991 invasion of, or the 1991 war in Iraq and Kuwait, he said, if Kuwait grew carrots, we wouldn't give a damn. I mean, I love that quote. It's fantastic. Because it really gets to the point. I mean, so much of the Middle East has been really wrapped around oil, right? And so this is a broader question. And in some way, I would say, as part of the diplomacy, we've obviously heard for such a long time, there's an effort to pivot to Asia, pivot to something other than the Middle East. I mean, there's certainly enough fatigue, the forever wars. You can't ignore and thank you, Shibli, for the amazing polling that you do on so many of these issues. I watch them and look for them very much in my own work and thinking. So my point here is that I think that there are, again, other challenges happening where even Americans are looking at the Middle East differently. You see that certainly in the progressive part of the Democratic Party and even the Republicans, right? I mean, that sort of Reagan's Republicans aren't there anymore. They're more the Trumpians, and they're very much don't want to, again, they're not willing to go to war to keep the price of oil at the gas pumps low anymore. And so I think there are many things going on that make me, it's actually, and I think Karen did such an amazing job of talking about how the oil economy works from an industry level, but it suggests to say that, again, for Arab countries, their relative importance to the United States is going to decrease. I mean, take all these structural features, and I'm not certainly one that thinks that everything must be seen through the prism of oil when it comes to the Middle East. That's absolutely absurd, but it is a factor, and it's a really big factor. We know that historically. I don't think any student of Middle East politics could ignore that, big issue here. Certainly, I mean, I'm not taking away from other arguments of counterterrorism and other concerns that the Americans have, but this is really fundamental. And so I can't see the Saudi American relationship, which of course is enormously under flux today for a variety of reasons, from the issue of 9/11 to certainly even MBS and Khashoggi. There's so much going on there, but will it ever, I'm being honestly imaginative here, will it ever be the same? Will it ever be something akin to the 1940s, 50s, or 60s? I don't think so. And I think that's, even despite the very warm ties that we saw with the Trump administration, I think there is something, again, deeper here where the Middle East is not going to be relevant in the same way. Then I'm going to go on to a question of renewables, because this is really important part of it. We can't ignore the reality that renewables are getting better. They are getting cheaper. First of all, Karen is absolutely right. There is no switch today to turn from oil and gas to renewables. It doesn't exist. There's just not enough of it. And certainly the price point is still very high. But the regulatory pressure that's being put on companies, particularly in the West, is enormous to do so. Increasingly, I think investment in renewables, some of the great applications that are happening that doesn't get as much, I think, sort of attention, but perhaps in my role as an administrator at the university, I come from a STEM-based university where, conversations about blockchain and AI and all these great advancements in the Internet of Things and, clean energy, the technological innovations that are happening on that is absolutely amazing. So I think we're also going to see a very rapid advancement in renewables. And that means prices will go down because it really is a supply demand issue. And overall, it has been relatively expensive, but the prices are coming down in a way that is pretty exponential. And I think that's really going to even further put pressure. Again, back to the regulatory, we're already seeing, I believe California has, we similarly have done the same in parts of Canada, where already there are mandates on provincial and state level governments to ensure that there is a full acceptance of hybrid cars at some point, or electric vehicles, including the infrastructure development. I mean, the whole Biden, clean energy program includes enormous investments in thinking about electric cars and ensuring that we have the infrastructure to do that, because again, the biggest concern in that market is often distance, right? It's about am I going to be stranded in the middle of where with nowhere to recharge? Well, that is I think something that is going to be on the agenda of all governments today, is really investing in the infrastructure, which, to add a third point, is a good investment of a government stimulus, right? I mean, if you think about the 1930s coming out of World War II, so I should say 1940s and 50s. I mean, making the highway system and the bridge system, fantastic, was all a part of the advancements of the car. Today, it will be, I think, the investment in these electric vehicle charging stations and the rest of it that is going to as well shift us towards more renewable energy and uses like electricity in our travel. So that's a little bit of a few thoughts, and hopefully added some more flavor and additional perspectives to the great comments I've already heard. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Besma, and thank you, Karen, because I said thank you when I was muted to you, Karen. So both were outstanding presentations, as I would have expected. Besma, I want to also draw you on, particularly after when I asked Tarek on this question about sort of the focal point of the US, particularly in its policy in the Middle East. Of course, this is an energy panel, so we're focused on energy. And you're right, absolutely right, that energy and oil have been a huge part of how America defined its policy broadly in the region. Can't understand it without that. But to be honest, in the past few years, it hasn't been energy that is driving the force. And we have not mentioned the word Israel, because obviously this is not about Israel, it's about energy. But keep in mind that even what looked like an energy commitment or energy-driven policy, such as the Trump administration policy toward the Arab Gulf states or Iran, it was much more a function of the Trump's support for Israel than it was driven by energy. Let's keep that in mind when we look at the big picture, not to get entangled just with this one issue, which admittedly is extremely important, and certainly in historical perspective had been a dominant factor. I turn to Camille.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you for having me. I'm really enjoying this discussion. So I've been asked to talk about the Red Sea and how that fits into the picture. I found that quite challenging because when it comes to energy and energy diplomacy, the Red Sea is ironically both central to issues related to energy security. Its geopolitics have been shaped by these issues throughout. And at the same time, it's a region that is often perceived a bit at the margins of the geopolitical focus. It's often perceived more as a transit region or a border region that falls between other more important subregions like the Gulf, like the Western Indian Ocean, like the Mediterranean. And in itself, it's remained quite underexploited on the energy side, mainly because of its topography, because it's deeper, it's more expensive, it's more complicated to exploit. You have here and there a couple of deals and opportunities, but it remains quite marginal. And even for the countries that are bordering the Red Sea, the Sudan, for example, has been a big oil producer for a long time. And for example, China's increasing presence in the region has been mainly shaped by or driven by this need to secure access to energy supplies. And they have invested quite massively in the country on its infrastructures for this reason. But this has been curbed quite importantly since 10 years ago, since the partition of South Sudan, where most of the resources were lying. And same for the Saudi side. On the Saudi side as well, most of the energy the center is on the Gulf side of the country, even if we see a sort of not shift, but growing Saudi emphasis on its energy facilities on its Red Sea coast, where they try to bypass the Strait of Hormuz and have more of its oil that is being shipped through its Red Sea facilities. The bulk of it remains on the Gulf side still. And so the importance of the Red Sea has been more revolving around its role as an energy corridor. And just to remind numbers, it sees almost 10% of total seaborne traded petroleum and LNG. And even with the evolutions of global energy markets, it remains a key waterway. So for example, the fact that a growing share of Gulf energy exports are being made towards Asia means that there is less northbound traffic through the Suez Canal, for example. But the southbound traffic is growing, coming from the US and Russian crude oil and petroleum products that are being exported to Asia through the Suez Canal. So it's a route that remains very relevant. And also, for example, we talk a lot about the Suez Canal, but there were also a few interesting developments, for example, on the Trans-Israeli pipeline that connects Ashkelon on the Mediterranean and Eilat on the Red Sea. And so as we talk about energy diplomacy in that region, it will be interesting to see also how the rapprochement between Israel and some of its Arab neighbors could open the door to new cooperation on these issues. So the problem is that a lot of the Red Sea geopolitical relevance has been seen through that prism of energy security and freedom of navigation. And a big emphasis has been put by Western powers and by the US on securing the continuous flow through that waterway, but without necessarily paying much attention to what was happening around and how the region as a geopolitical region was operating. And so a lot of the security buildup around the Gulf of Aden, for example, was about curbing piracy threats. And it was about also the US have tried to make sure to depoliticize the Red Sea as a waterway, to try to make sure that the waterway itself would not be geopolitically contested. But the problem of that approach and that focus on energy security and freedom of navigation is that, yes, piracy threats have been curbed, so there is less of a sense of urgency on that front, because also of the evolution of global energy markets. There might be a sense that energy security is not necessarily a top priority to the extent that it was in the past. We are in a period where the US is trying to shift a bit its involvement towards other theaters, towards the Asia Pacific, etc., and trying to decrease a bit its involvement in that part of the world. And the problem is that because a lot of the efforts in the Red Sea have been put on securing freedom of navigation, much less attention has been put on how the maritime security threats link to the continental ones, how the different countries and stakeholders that are bordering the Red Sea interact with each other, how that creates cycles of violence and instability. And the problem is that today we have a resurgence of these cycles of instability and of great power competition in that area that have not been addressed in a comprehensive manner until now. And we see it, for example, it's quite obvious when you look at how the different countries of the Red Sea fall between different administrative divisions or different departments or different US comments. There is quite little literature as well on the Red Sea as a geopolitical space that, with the dynamics of its own. And so the problem is that the root causes of instability in that area, because of that focus on energy security, all these root causes of instability have not been addressed and understood properly. And that creates new maritime security threats that are reemerging. So we have cycles of violence and conflicts and failed states around that region. We have a dozen of active conflicts, with difficult political transitions as well, especially in the Horn. And that has potential spillover effects on freedom of navigation, as we saw with the Houthi attacks in the area. We see also growing interconnectedness between conflicts on both shores, with arms trafficking between Yemen, the Horn, with interconnections between some smuggling activities in the Red Sea and terrorism. And that feeds into a cycle of instability. We see also growing entanglement of political rivalries between both shores, with growing assertiveness of certain regional powers that are undertaking more independent foreign policies that project influence in their direct neighborhood. So we saw that with GCC countries, for example, projecting influence in the Horn of Africa. But we see also some African countries becoming more assertive in their foreign policies, especially Ethiopia and Egypt at the moment. Another point that is very important for the US is the resurgence also of potentially great power competition, with big external powers building a presence in the region. And we see, so there has been continuous interest of Russia, of course, but we see emerging Chinese presence. It is a region that is one of the most militarized in the world. And the naval presence in that region, also from Western powers, is shifting from trying to target piracy like it was 10 years ago, towards increasingly addressing these great power rivalry dynamics that are mounting in the region. And the problem for the US perspective on that is that there is growing uncertainties on the future of US involvement in that area. And this is problematic because we see a resurgence of these challenges, and it will make it difficult for the US to completely ignore that region in any case. And of course, like energy security and freedom of navigation remain crucial, but it's no longer necessarily like energy is no longer necessarily like the one driving element of Red Sea geopolitics. It's about projecting influence. It's about controlling strategic trade corridors or specific infrastructure like strategic ports or even internet cables. You have between 17 and 30% of world internet traffic that passes through the Red Sea. And China, for example, because we talk a lot about China, is definitely a player that the US is watching very closely in that area. But even China's interest in the Red Sea region is less and less about energy security. It was the one key driver for China's presence in the area maybe 10 years ago. But now it's also about controlling access to key maritime trade routes and developing, access to developing markets and resources, and gaining influence and support of these countries on international forums. So for the US, there is a need to acknowledge more how the Red Sea integrates itself into broader geoeconomic and geopolitical agendas and within broader security complexes. So a need to understand how these maritime security threats connect with continental security threats in the Red Sea region, how the Red Sea fits into the Middle East and Mediterranean security complex, and at large as well, how that fits into the broader Indo-Pacific complex and this kind of re-emerging East-West security axis. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thanks for an excellent presentation, Camille. This has really been a very enlightening conversation altogether, and I appreciate that everybody kept on time. So we ended up, with 1 hour. We now have a bit of time for conversation. I do have some questions from the audience that I'm going to put on the table, but I do, as I promised earlier when I talked to Tariq, raise this question about, the question actually Tariq and Besma brought it up in terms of what drives American policy and how it's likely to be affected. So one of the things that, we are, of course, assuming that American policy is calculating and rational most of the time, and it is part of the time overall. But those of you who may have followed the news in the past few days, when I hosted a forum on Friday, my colleague from Brookings, Bruce Riedel, who was at the White House when the horror of 9/11 occurred, he was with George W. Bush, the President of the United States, in the Oval Office 3 days later, 20 years today, September 14th, 2001, when Bush picked up the phone and called Tony Blair and told him, "We are going to attack Iraq." This happened 3 days before any consideration, any discussion, or any cause or effect, or anything to do, whether it had to do with 9/11 or to do with oil or to do with anything else. So, and to this day, I think it's a puzzle as to what was driving him. We could talk about that. But the point is, and we know that how disastrous that turned out, not just for the Middle East, of course, it has been disastrous, but for the United States. And so one of the questions that I want to put on the table for Tariq and Besma, particularly anybody else who wants to comment on it, is when you're calculating, were you warning, well, if the US withdraws from the Middle East, if the US then China and Russia are going to gain, or they're going to have a better relationship, economic relationship, and more coincidence of interest over oil with the Arab Gulf producer or Middle Eastern, including Iran, Middle Eastern oil, energy producers. Now, so what? I mean, I want to put that out on the table. I mean, what is it that the U.S. has to fear, particularly when you compare it to the cost that the U.S. has paid over the past couple of decades and more? Because I think I can make the argument, and many have made the argument, the U.S. is weaker globally today than it was 20 years ago because of its intervention. I mean, it's weaker vis-a-vis China, it's weaker vis-a-vis Russia. So what is it that the U.S. Is going to lose by that? And I'm not sure, I heard that. I'd love to hear more about it.
Besma, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I mean, Shibli, you put a very big question or a challenge for us on the table, and one that I'm inclined to agree with you on at one level. And I would say increasingly in the region, the sense of US withdrawal and US retreat is not necessarily seen as big a shock or as destabilizing a problem as it was, let's say, 10 years ago. Meaning there is a growing realization that the US is not what it used to be or what we thought it is. And for even regimes that had depended on the US, the unpredictability of policy at times, the mistakes of the last 20 years, and the many symptoms of withdrawal have driven home the realization that not only is the US withdrawing, that actually may not be a bad thing. And anyway, we could live with it. So I think we're moving in this direction, and maybe you're right. The US doesn't lose so much. In fact, the US has an opportunity to refocus on domestic priorities, unless, of course, the confrontation with China and Russia become the pivotal question. And that would then present tough choices for the US. How far do you go? Do you confront them only geopolitically on security affairs, or do you go into energy markets and economic areas as well? On the other hand, Shibli, and this is where I think, unfortunately, the way you have painted the pattern in which US policy and involvement is likely to evolve, this plays very well to China's and Russia's advantage. These are not countries that are interested in a unified Arab world or a coordinating Arab world or a cooperating Arab world. If anything, they are interested in bilateral relations. They have focused on that. They have perfected the game. China in particular is playing a very, very long game in the region. And a fragmented Arab world as we see today, and we're likely to see more of in the future, is going to further be convenient and workable from the perspective of China and Russia, as opposed to the US, where an alliance-based mindset, an unwillingness to put the resources in, and the fatigue you've painted is further discouraging of any renewed involvement. And quite frankly, Shibli, I don't think I'm alone. I don't think I'm sharing a secret. The growing sense in the region at large that the days of US commitment, presence, activism, energy are behind us. And we have to now think about a future of the Middle East and the Arab world where we need to live, exist, and accept US retreat and uncertainty vis-a-vis the US. And maybe that's not such a bad thing after all.
Yeah. And Basma, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, such thought-provoking questions. Thank you for that. So, what I find interesting, back to polls, which you'll appreciate, Shibli, is, when Pew Research did polls about sentiment about the Americans in the Middle East, if you recall, it was, what are the things that you dislike the most about the United States? And it was their foreign policy. But then if asked the question, well, what do you think about American values, American education, American culture? Loved it, right? So, in some way, I can't help but think if you had really a disinterested America in, day-to-day Middle East security affairs, you might actually find bilateral relations warming. Ironically, it might just be that way. The second part of that is, and I'm not happy about this part, but it might actually be good for the Americans on the economic side, because US arms sales are going to go through the roof. That's what we're seeing happening in the Gulf today. They're arming themselves, right? They're putting in missile defense systems to protect themselves against the Iranians because they don't expect the Americans to come rushing to their defense as they did 20 years ago. So I think that also it's, feeding into the military industrial complex, but that is, at the end of the day, it might just be a net benefit for the Americans in some way, just throwing that out there. On the question of China, I know there's a lot of, so many speculative papers, been hearing about this for so long about China's going to come and, replace the Americans in the Middle East. I've been reading papers like this for the past at least 15, 20 years. At the end of the day, China is far more strategic than the Americans have been on this. They look at the Middle East as a quagmire. They're not interested in replacing the Americans militarily. If you see Xi's speeches, it's consistent. The Americans, are wasting their time, their money. They're quite literally, he said something to the effect of their dilapidated, infrastructure is all because they spend their money on militarizing the Middle East. The Chinese are smarter in that way. They're not willing to invest, right? That kind of effort. So, they put a ship in the Persian Gulf here and there, but ultimately they don't have an interest in a military presence. They want deals. They want economic bilateral relationship. And they're getting that because they're energy hungry. This is obviously a population of almost 2 billion that have almost no real source of domestic fuel consumption or a fuel source. So they're extremely energy hungry. And they're never going to be a way to move completely away from oil in the short term because of the size of the population. So that's one thing. Russia, great question on Russia. It's far more interested in an Eastern European front. That to them is their backyard. You could look and say, well, what explains their involvement in Syria? Well, that was because of the Caucasus, right? They had 5,000 Chechnyan fighters leave, and the fear was always coming back home. Do they have a huge military interest in the Middle East? Look, they're a spoiler. Their whole MO is about being, bringing in chaos wherever they go so they look better at home. And certainly they would absolutely continue playing disinformation and all the sort of usual ways of, causing trouble. That suits them very nicely. But to put real troops and hard assets, I mean, I think Syria is an anomaly. It was a port. Tartus was really one of the few accesses they had to, or the only access, sorry, to the Mediterranean. It was one of the few ports outside of their own shoreline, let's say, that they wanted to keep. So it was really vital for them. And even there, they put really, really small amount of investment. I mean, people make a big deal out of it because it was such a game changer, only because the Americans and then the whole West didn't want to enter Syria because the Russians were already there. But truly, this is a declining power. They don't have a military in the same way they used to. So I don't really see anybody replacing the Americans in the Middle East in that way. I see actually them, Arab countries themselves, fortifying themselves more, arming themselves more, investing more in their military, which was what we're seeing actually happening, particularly in the Gulf countries. So again, I actually think that was such a provocative question. I never thought of it, but it's such a great question. And it just might, at the end of the day, be better for the Americans if they withdrew. And I don't think there's going to be this mad dash of competitors coming in, because neither they have the capability or interest to really do the same thing the Americans have been offering most of the Arab countries. Thank you.
Thanks. So now I'm going to turn to a number of questions from the audience. I have one question, perhaps to Karen. Can you comment on China's relationship with Iran when it comes to oil and how that affects energy production and security in the region?
Right. Well, thanks. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot been said about this potential agreement between the Chinese and the Iranians for economic cooperation, for a lot of investment perhaps into Iran, but it's really not money on the table. This is more kind of in our perfect world what might happen. So it hasn't happened yet. But the Iranians are increasing their shipments of oil to China. They are evading sanctions in doing so. And the Chinese are, gladly taking what they can at a reduced price, right? So it's sort of worked well for both sides. And this cement, again, this, as Besma described, these bilateral relationships where China doesn't really have to put a lot on the table, doesn't have to make any security guarantee, and really gets a discount product and, as their profit. I would just, if we could just go back to the previous conversation just a tad. I mean, I think these arguments about why the Middle East should matter to the United States and what are the consequences of a disengaged United States from the region. I think what's missing from that is an understanding of how we are reshaping the structure of the international economy with this disengagement. So yes, it may absolutely be true that our bilateral ties and the perception of America may improve in the Middle East. It also absolutely may be true that we see an increase in arms sales and an arms race, particularly a nuclear arms race, I think is happening next, as it's pretty much a given now that Iran will come to a bomb. But the bad thing, in my view, is that we are going to see the highest growing, highest populations parts of our world, the most energy hungry, reshaping their institutions and their economies in ways which are in line with authoritarian capitalism, right? They're going to model their economies in different ways where it's going to be at the disadvantage of the United States and US citizens and institutions and our firms and our banks to be able to operate in that space. We sacrifice something ourselves in that. So I think that's the argument that you have to make of why the United States needs to maintain, in some ways also, a security posture in the region to defend that system. Now, it's not a very popular view anymore, but I feel like it has to be on the table. It's part of the argument. There was another question about, why isn't U.S. oil production part of the conversation and, kind of the OPEC plus environment? Why don't we coordinate more on global supply? We're not running out of it, right? We have plenty, but we're in this transition moment where there are a lot of disruptions and sort of misunderstandings of, where the oil is and how to get it to who needs it. And so I think this collaboration with Russia, in particular with the Gulf states, is on a bit of thin ice. And I don't know how long that will persist. I also don't know what this means for, U.S. domestic production. We have a lot of kind of legal gray area for, how our shale industry will continue and rebound. But for the Russians right now, they're not even able to meet their quotas under the OPEC plus agreement. They're not able to produce what they're allowed to produce, right? So, they've been at a bit of a they've had advantages that other producers haven't had, sort of a cushy quota, which, they're not really getting there. So that has to do with where the capex situation is globally, and really in terms of, what Russia's capacity is.
Those are really important points. And I didn't hear anyone, including Besma, say that the US is actually going to fully withdraw from the Middle East, because that's not likely, as everybody has pointed out. It's a question of how you set your priorities, what's important, how you don't repeat the previous mistake of overwhelming intervention in a way that's detrimental to your interests. But obviously, we are at a juncture where these interests have to be reassessed for sure. The next question is for Camille, I think would directly ask to Camille, which is, how do you see the competition amongst the Gulf states shaping the geopolitics of the Red Sea?
Sure. This one has been quite an interesting topic for the past few years. So we've seen definitely lots of cases of Gulf countries projecting some of their rivalries on other theaters, and the Horn is one of them. Somalia, Sudan have been some of the key focus points. And but the one question recently was to what extent, with the patching up a bit of this relationship intra-GCC, to what extent that would also ease a bit the competition in the Horn. And it seems that for now, it's still continuing to kind of the same level that it was before, with CC, for example, the Qataris trying to regain a bit of influence, especially in Sudan, where they have reopened their relations earlier this year. In Somalia, also trying to play a bigger role in the election issues that we had also earlier this year. So this is still ongoing. But the real question is, and I think that's the question that was asked, is to what extent do they really shape what is happening in the Horn? And the thing is that when you see the amount of money that has been poured from the Gulf into the Horn, with trying to shape these dynamics, trying to gain some friendly regimes or gain some specific concessions. At the end of the day, it looks like this attempt has been a little bit of maybe not a failure, but has not been as successful maybe as what was attempted to. And we see that at the end of the day, Horn countries still have a lot of agency, and they have been playing off different external players also to their own interests. And so sometimes we need to move beyond a little bit this representation of these passive African states that are being manipulated by external powers. And when you look, for example, even some of the achievements that have been made by Gulf states, like this very mediatized Ethiopia-Eritrea rapprochement, for example, that was orchestrated by the UAE and Saudi Arabia. When you talk to the Horn side, they tell you that they didn't have really much of a role anyway. They hosted it. They gave a bit of money in exchange of that kind of arrangement. But at the end of the day, the real politics happened on the Horn side. And today, when the Europeans or the US are trying to engage Gulf countries on trying to solve issues like the Grand Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia, they realize that they can try to provide some investment packages as an incentive, but they don't have the power to really shape and push these countries to take decisions if these countries are not ready to take these decisions. So that's the big problem: is to what extent this Gulf influence is really shaping politics in the Horn or not.
If anyone wants to add to this, feel free. But I want to ask the next question from Imad Harb to Besma Momani or anybody else, but it's really regarding the the comment that Basma made, we're not going back to the same old mode, particularly this remote kind of a mode of work, which I witness and everybody is witnessing, and some industries are feeling, and they know they're not going back to where it was before. Has anybody done any kind of calculation on the energy consumption impact of a profound change in the mode of work that we have? Obviously, many of us probably on this panel flew all the way to Europe to just a 1 hour lecture and turn around and come all the way back from Europe. And so I wonder, obviously what, the implications that could be considerable, but is there any study of this at this point?
Not that I'm aware of, to be honest with you. I think there's just so many things in flux. I'm not sure if Karen might have some, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, Karen, too, but some of the estimates of how much of, the figure I would think about too is think about sort of how much consumption of oil and fuel is individual. Think of the fact that, of a 7-day week, we probably drive the most on, 5 work days. And I think you can at least divide that by half. I mean, many of us are talking about a hybrid model, with some of the tech industry talking about completely getting rid of commuting. So I don't know. I mean, Karen, if you know that one little number or have anything to add from an industry perspective, I'd be fascinated to hear too.
I would just say, a lot of our global oil demand, about 10% of it is in transport, right? And so airlines are already being very vocal about their concerns for recovery, particularly into early 2022. And the expectation is that business travel is falling off and will not rebound, right? So I mean, if we're at 100 million barrels a day, that's, chopping off a good part of that 10 million, right at the top. So yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, and commuting goes into that as well.
One question here that perhaps can go to Tarek on the role of Russia, the Russia's relationship with OPEC, really, about sort of the possible cooperation and conflict, when it comes to energy output, and any thoughts that you may add on that kind of relationship and where it's headed.
Thank you, Shibli. I think maybe Karen can do a better job answering that question. From my own vantage point, I have been a bit surprised at how well that relationship has worked so far, especially once the Russians and the Saudis have managed to find a working relationship to help manage the OPEC plus group. I think, as had been mentioned earlier, this relationship extends now beyond the state-to-state relationship. It's also a relationship between the respective national oil companies who not only work well together, understand one another, but increasingly are also cooperating through investment deals. This is not just Saudi Arabia and the Russians, or the Emiratis and the Russians. This is also Qatar and the Russians. The Russians, it seems to me, this is one area where their soft/economic leverage and diplomacy has allowed them to be seen and to become a critical player in maintaining stability within OPEC. How long this will go, I think it's going to be subject to some of the uncertainties that have been discussed earlier about the energy transition, the rise of gas, and what I think Karen was pointing out to earlier, which is that gas is going to be where geopolitical competition is likely to take place over the next decade or two as a transition between crude and renewables. That is certainly the view amongst many observers, and that actually creates a lot of potential complications, but also opportunities for Russia to become not only an important player on the production and marketing and sharing side, but also on the pipelines. One country we haven't talked about today, I don't think anyone has mentioned them since the morning, is Turkey. Turkey has interests in the Mediterranean. It has interests with Russia. It has interests in Europe. It's potentially a supplier, but also a transit for a lot of the important pipelines that bring Russian gas. So a lot to put in the mix with geopolitical implications and complexity that, quite frankly, are going to require a Herculean effort, but also a very tactful management by any US energy diplomacy in the future.
Great. Karen, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I would just say, one of the things that we're seeing among national oil companies and sovereign wealth funds is that they're willing to be in each other's businesses, right? And so these are, very, very competitive sectors, whether it's oil or gas or renewables. But you see a lot of hedging, and that's why Qatar, Kuwait, UAE, and Saudi Arabia, their sovereign wealth funds have partnerships with the Russian sovereign wealth fund, and they invest in each other's energy businesses. You'll see Gulf companies investing in the Arctic projects in Russia. But it's also true that Tarek says, the next sort of wave or big market to that will impact our geopolitics is a gas market. And so this is why Nord Stream 2 is so important, and Russia's ability to supply Europe. And this is why also you see players in the Middle East getting into that East Med business, including the Gulf states. So I did mention in my remarks the Emirati investment, the Mubadala investment in the Tamar field owned by Israel. That's one great example of this kind of hedging strategy of being in all energy product lines, right? So that's why these relationships, particularly the Gulf Russia relationship, they're quite tenuous. They use each other, but ultimately they are competitors.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to all four of you for a really exceptional set of presentations and conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it and learned from it, and I'm sure everybody else. Thank you all, those who joined us, for joining us. My apologies to anyone whose questions we did not get to in time. I also should say that day 2 of this conference is tomorrow, and you're free to join tomorrow morning. You can register at arabcenterdc.org. This was great. Thank you all, and hope to see you tomorrow.